1st. And we're looking forward to the summit. And Emily, I'm going to turn it over. MC, I'm going to turn it over to you to go ahead and admit people. So great. Here we go. All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Living Shoreline Summit. We're going to be giving folks just a couple moments to join. And people won't be able to see your name and affiliation until everyone joins. So in a minute or two, we're going to be asking for introductions in the chat roll. Feel free to go ahead and just take a look around at who's in the space. You're welcome to your cameras on. We know many of you have likely worked together for a long, long time or might be brand new to working. So welcome to the summit. We're excited that you're here, and we'll get started in just a moment. If you are just joining and you're in a place with background noise, we invite you to go ahead and mute.
I can't hear anything.
So welcome. We're glad that you're here today. We'll have just this always slightly awkward moment of people joining, but we know we have a full house today.
No.
Okay. All right. Emily, do you want to give it just another moment or so until we're going to continue to have people joining?
Sure, let's just give it another minute.
That sounds great. And I'm going to wait for you to let me know when you would like to start the slides as well. We can give it just a moment. That'd be great. Are you ready for that screen share now?
Yeah, why don't we pull those up now?
Sure. Pull it up in just a second. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Living Shoreline Summit. We're going to be doing introductions in just a moment as we're letting folks join. Can everyone see my screen okay? Great. We're so glad that you're here. Happy November. Happy November 1st. And we're going to be doing a little orientation to the space as well. But again, we're glad that you're here. Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Could I ask you to go to the first slide?
Yep. Sorry, everybody, for that. Yep.
They look very similar.
They do. It just happened to be where it was on the screen. Thanks for that.
Fantastic. All right. Yeah, I think we can go ahead and get started. This photo here is of Black Point on Jamestown Island. So a little preview of tomorrow's field trip. But first, I want to welcome you all to the 4th Living Shoreline Collaborative Annual Summit. We held our first summit in late February 2020. At one of our last in-person events, we held it in Hampton. And the theme was introducing the collaborative and soliciting feedback on opportunities for and barriers to living shorelines. Our next Living Shoreline Collaborative Summit was held virtually, obviously. And we focus on telling living shoreline success stories, as well as a series of breakout sessions that focus on a variety of topics, from living shoreline tools to technical assistance programs for living shorelines. Our third summit, we celebrated living shoreline related partnerships, as well as highlighting approaches and best practices to build equity more intentionally into our living shoreline work. We also included living shoreline case studies from other parts of Virginia beyond the James River watershed, as well as beyond Virginia. And so with that, I'm really excited for today's program, which will focus on creating living shorelines for the future using best practices and adaptive management in the context of climate change. I'm really excited for this topic. I think it's really relevant to where we are today in the field. We are going to be holding today's program virtually, obviously, but we also have an in-person field trip scheduled for tomorrow, which will feature the shoreline in the Jamestown area in Williamsburg, and the plans for adaptive management of existing shoreline structures, as well as managing the shoreline in a national park, where you have to balance these priorities of cultural resources, public access, along with the ecological concerns as well. So we do have part 2 to this summit tomorrow in person in Williamsburg, beginning at 12:30, but you do need to RSVP. So if you have not received an agenda from me with the details of that field trip, and you're interested in joining us, please RSVP before 3 p.m. today, just because we are going to close that registration this afternoon. But with that, can we go to the next slide? Thank you, Christine. I just wanted to thank all of the folks who have contributed to the planning of today's summit. Thank you to the presenters, both the folks who are joining us virtually. I think the benefit of holding this event virtually is that we're able to hear from people from outside of our region, from North Carolina to Delaware, as well as local experts. And thank you to the folks who are presenting tomorrow. We have Scott Hardaway and Donna Milligan of the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, as well as Dwayne Scheid of Colonial National Historical Park presenting at the field trip tomorrow. Thank you to the summit planning team, Aaron Went, Karen During, Shireen Hughes, and Amber Ellis for shaping this event, and Christine and her team at Dialogue and Design for all of the hard work they put into organizing it, and the Living Shoreline Collaborative Steering Committee, as well as our funding partner, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. I think next slide. I'm going to hand it off to Christine for some logistics and an agenda review.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily, and welcome all to the Living Shoreline Summit. It's really a delight to be here, and we invite you to make yourself comfortable today. We do have 3.5 hours this morning, and we do have a few breaks built in that we'll let you know about in just a moment. But if you need to step away, then we invite you to step away during the meeting. Many of you have been on about 8,000 Zoom meetings by this point, but just a couple best practices we wanted to remind you of. If you're in a place where your bandwidth is spotty, feel free to turn off your video. At the end, we will have a half-hour time for small group networking and lunch and topics. We'll tell you more about that later, but we invite you to have your videos on during that time period so you can really see people, as well as in just a moment, we're going to do introductions in the chat roll. I'm going to invite you to actually scroll through and see who else is in the space today. You're welcome to use the raise hand feature to ask a question, which you can find in your toolbar next to the reactions button. You're also welcome to put questions in the chat roll. We'll be monitoring that throughout the day today. And we welcome clarifying questions during the presentations, but any discussion type questions, we have time at the end of each session for questions at the end. So we welcome those later. We're going to go ahead and share the summit program in the chat roll. So I'm going to invite MC to go ahead and drop that in the chat roll. And I'm not viewing the chat right now, so Emily, if you've already done that, thank you. And we're also going to go ahead and drop the evaluation in the chat roll. We love to share that early. It's a digital evaluation, but your feedback is really important for us as we plan future events and meetings. So if you could take a little bit of time before the end of today and fill out that evaluation, we would greatly appreciate it. Last note on this screen, if you've just joined, we invite you to mute yourself, especially if you're in a place with background noise, and then feel free to unmute yourself if you ask questions. Okay, so here we are. We're doing introductions right now and the agenda review. You'll hear from our action team leads in just a few moments about a lot of the amazing work that's taking place across the Living Shoreline Collaborative. There's a lot happening beyond what you're going to hear about today, and it's a really amazing group, and the door is open to new members. So if you'd like to become engaged to a greater degree with the Living Shoreline Collaborative, we welcome that for your greater involvement. We're really looking forward to the session today. We have a really amazing lineup of speakers, including Tracy, who's going to be talking about living shoreline evolution, and we'll have an introduction to each speaker. At 9:45, we'll have a break, stretch break for 5 minutes, and then we go into session 2, learning from the past and looking back to move forward, which is one of the key themes of our session today. We'll have another break at 10:35. These times are, 10:36 maybe. And we'll move into our session 3, wide angle lens. We'll look out a little bit longer, wider. We have a full hour for that session. Designing living shorelines for the future. We'll have a closing and kind of let you know what's coming up next, a small break. And then we have half an hour for lunch, informal networking, discussion times around the topics that you can see here. Each of the rooms will be hosted by a dialogue and design and JRA staff member. So really looking forward to those and invite you to stay on until 12:30. If you need to step away, feel free to step away and then come back during the day today. I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen just for a moment. I'll start again, but I want to go ahead and invite you to share in the chat roll your name, your affiliation, and community member is a welcome affiliation. And if you have a favorite Halloween candy or treat, feel free to go ahead and share that in the chat roll too. And then if you're in a place you're able to share your screen, or excuse me, share your video, feel free to do so and just scroll through the room, see who else is in the summit today. So that's why I stopped sharing my screen, so it's a little easier for you to see each other. Many of you, again, have worked together for a long, long time. And for other folks, if this is your first introduction to Living Shorelines, welcome. So again, an open door. So name, affiliation, and if you have a favorite Halloween candy or treat, feel free to pop it in the chat roll. And then just take a look around. This is kind of your coffee moment to see who else is in the room, who else is in the space today. Great Reese's Pumpkins, Twix again, Kit Kats, Dove bars. A lot of chocolate for the win so far. Almond Joy, Baby Ruth, Chewy Spree. I don't know what a Chewy Spree is, but I'm going to find out. Snickers, Milky Way all day, Milky Way all the way. So again, for folks who are just joining, we're just taking a moment to see who else is in the space. Feel free to add your name, affiliation, community member is a welcome affiliation, and your favorite Halloween candy or treat. We're not asking for tricks, just treats. And again, feel free to scroll through the room, advance, see who else is in the space today. We have a lot of great folks are here. I want to give a special shout out of thanks to the Dialogue and Design team, Emily Carlson, Leah Taylor, and Philippa Belches, who have done just tremendous hard work and are here today. So big shout out of thanks to each of you. Leah's last day is Thursday with Dialogue and Design. So wave goodbye to Leah. Philippa is going to be coming on board to help out. Emily is rolling with us. So we're just excited and really grateful for the Dialogue and Design team. So with that, Emily Henson, anything else you could think of that's helpful for us to share? Otherwise, before I share my screen again?
I don't think so. Let's get rolling.
All right, great. So again, welcome everybody. We're glad you're here, and I'm going to turn it back over to Emily Henson as I share my screen for an overview of the Living Shoreline Collaborative and then action team highlights. Okay, Emily, over to you.
Right. Thank you, Christine. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the Living Shoreline Collaborative. I know we have a lot of folks who have been working with the collaborative for years now, but we also have a few new faces. So we always like to take some time and introduce ourselves and our goals. So the Living Shoreline Collaborative is a group of state and regional partners working together to scale up implementation of living shorelines in the tidal James River watershed. And we've been meeting since late 2018, so several years now, and the group has seen a lot of growth and evolution over the last couple of years. Can you go to the next slide, Christine? Thank you. So here we have our vision and mission, as well as an image of the action plan, where we have laid out sort of a detailed plan through, well, it was a 3-year plan. It's going through the end of 2023, which is coming up really soon now, just around our shared goals around living shorelines. So We have a big focus on building knowledge of living shoreline project performance, increasing capacity to implement these projects, building relationships and partnerships and collaboration around living shorelines, and as well as elevating the acceptance of living shorelines in our region. And we have way more detail about that in the action plan, which we have on our website, and I will be sure to send as a follow-up if anyone is interested in reading a little bit more detail on that. Next slide. So we have multiple ways to get involved with the Living Shoreline Collaborative. We do meet on a monthly basis as a steering committee. And as Christine mentioned, the door is open. If you're interested in being a part of that, please do reach out to me. We also hold workshops periodically throughout the year for shoreline professionals and practitioners. We have some really exciting workshops coming out of the training team, and we will highlight those at the end of the summit today. We also have held field visits to living shoreline projects to see projects that have been installed and how they're performing, the good and the work in progress. And then we also have installed living shoreline demonstration projects in areas where there are not very many living shorelines in that region. So the bottom right photo there is a photo of a living shoreline demonstration project that was installed in Isle of Wight County, a rural county on the south bank of the James. We also hold quarterly meetings. So in addition to this big summit that we hold on an annual basis, we hold meetings that are focused on specific issues that the collaborative is tackling. So we held an in-person meeting in September in Hampton, focused on monitoring living shoreline projects. Before that, we held a virtual one focused on marketing and communicating around living shorelines. So, those are also open door if you're interested in joining. We do advertise those in our Living Shoreline Collaborative newsletter. So we welcome people to participate at any level that they're interested and able to. And we try to let folks know where those opportunities are in our monthly newsletter. And if you're not already signed up for that, I will send a link for signing up for the newsletter in the follow-up email for today. And what I'll do next is hand it over in a minute to the action team leads. After meeting as a collaborative for a few years, we established 3 sort of focus areas or action teams where the group felt there was a lot of work that needed to be done. And so the 3 teams are the training team, headed by Shireen Hughes of Wetlands Watch and the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program, the implementation and outreach team, which James River Association leads, and I'll have Ryan Walsh describe that to you guys. And then the monitoring team led by Karen During at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And so they're just gonna give brief highlights on what those teams are up to. And once again, if something that they say, sparks your interest, they're always looking for new members and new perspectives. So please do not hesitate to reach out to any of the action team leads or myself about that. But with that, Christine, I'll ask you to advance the slide, and I'm going to hand it off to Shireen.
Thank you, Emily, and welcome everybody. Our goal on the training team is to grow a network of skilled living shoreline professionals to support our partner programs and projects in our region, and then eventually beyond our region, and then connect these qualified service providers with clients and funding. We convened our training team, and many of the people on the training team are actually here today. And it's a multi-state, multi-discipline group of living shoreline experts. We convened in 2021. We interviewed members of the training team, contractors, permitting agents, reviewed existing Living Shoreline training programs, reviewed permits, and then we tested out an installation field practicum with Jim Cahoon in April 2022. Our goal is, we're in the final stages of planning a two-part series of professional development workshops. It's geared towards cross-training existing CBLPs, Chesapeake Bay landscape professionals, and other shoreline professionals seeking to add Virginia General Permit Types 1 and 2 living shoreline services to their business offerings, and some professional development for some of the existing living shoreline contractors out there. Our first webinar will be December, and it's going to be free, and you can just go to that one. But if you want to go on to the next stage of essential skills for living shorelines, you'll need to attend that basics webinar. We're in the final stages of setting up our experienced instructors, finalizing agendas, activities, and resources, and our tentative dates for the essential skills is March 10th, 17th, and 18th. And then if you want a CBLP shoreline certificate, you will also attend an installation practicum similar to the one we ran with Jim Cahoon in spring of 2022. If you have any questions, type them in the text in the chat, or I will actually put my email and my associate, Stacy McGraw, who's been amazing, in the chat. We'll put our emails and you can contact us. But registration is at cblpro.org.
Great, thanks so much, Shireen, and we'll turn it over to Karen. There was a request for the live transcript, which we've enabled. Just wanted to let everyone know that you can see that. We will be sharing a summary from the meeting as well. And actually, it's going to be Ryan for the implementation and outreach team. So Ryan, over to you, and then Karen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Walsh with the James River Association. I'm on the implementation and outreach team. Here we have our Living Shoreline Stewardship Fund. This is a fund from a NIFWIF grant. They can help provide some TLC to existing living shorelines. We most recently did one at Phoebus Waterfront Park in the historic Phoebus neighborhood in Hampton, Virginia. We're also working on marketing living shorelines and sort of creating a brand around living shorelines as a concept, as well as for the Living Shoreline Collaborative. And we're currently using a VAX funding to help fund a living shoreline on some agricultural property in Charles City County. There's numerous farms in the area that are watching to see how this project goes. So fingers crossed that we have a successful living shoreline installed.
Great, thanks, Ryan, and Karen, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Karen During with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, or VIMS. The monitoring team is working on ways to gather and share knowledge about project performance to learn what best practices have greatest success for both shoreline stabilization and water quality protection. There are many people who are helping with this team, and their input and experience is really appreciated. We've reviewed the current living shoreline monitoring effort to identify gaps and challenges and successes. We've studied the formal monitoring protocols and frameworks that have been established in other states, and we'll learn about some of that today. And we're also now working on low-cost, standardized monitoring protocols like these other states' frameworks have. And we're also investigating ways to sustain a monitoring data sharing platform. Especially, how can we take advantage of crowdsourced GIS applications so that more people can participate in collecting and sharing monitoring data and information. And monitoring doesn't just begin after a project is constructed. It actually begins at the very beginning of the project concept. So this is something that we are learning more about and how to identify that whole process. This monitoring is even more relevant now as we attempt to learn from the past in order to plan and design for the future for both present and future conditions. So I'm going to be listening very closely today to capture all the relevant monitoring ideas and suggestions. And during tomorrow's field trip, we'll learn about a monitoring and adaptation project to revisit a shoreline management plan that was written 20 years ago by VIMS for the Jamestown Island shorelines. VIMS has monitored these living shoreline projects around the island since then, and they're going to be examining which ones need adaptation measures for them to remain effective into the future. This is just one example of how the Living Shoreline Collaborative provides the opportunity to share knowledge we've gained across multiple stakeholders and interest groups to expand monitoring efforts and results beyond the academic arena. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Karen. What an amazing team across the board. So much great work taking place. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, and I'm going to just hit a couple housekeeping items. So let's see here. Yay for screen share and Zoom. There we go. All right. So a few things. If you've just joined, you're welcome to share your name and affiliation in the chat roll. We welcome clarifying questions during the sessions. We'll have time for discussion at the end. You're welcome to raise your hand as well, but the chat roll is a little bit easier. If you're joining by phone only, we will have a chance for phone only participants to be able to ask questions too. We ask people to spell out acronyms the first time that you use them so everyone's on the same page about what you mean. So Karen, thanks so much for doing that. I heard that VIMS, not Virginia Institute of Marine Science, and then Karen said VIMS, so great modeling there. And really want to thank our presenters again for joining, the Living Shoreline Collaborative Steering Committee, and to thank all our presenters for staying on time. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Karen, who's going to be introducing Tracy. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Karen, over to you.
And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Tracy Skrabal. Tracy is a coastal scientist with the North Carolina Coastal Federation, a citizen-based conservation group working with partners to ensure clean water and natural resource protection in North Carolina's 20 coastal counties. Tracy has been with the Coastal Federation since 1997. She's also worked as a state regulator in Delaware, as a private consultant, an advocate and lobbyist for coastal protection, and has over 35 years of experience in education, regulation, design, and construction of living shorelines. Tracy has an undergraduate degree in geology from the College of William and Mary and a master's degree in geological oceanography from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. So to prepare for this introduction, I read Tracy's master's thesis about the fate of beach nourishment sediments placed along a VIMS shoreline. Her final conclusions back in 1987 will be echoed here again today. She wrote, "Any discussion of shoreline erosion and beach protection should address the effects of sea level rise. At what rate of sea level rise does the beach nourishment alternative become economically not an alternative?" She also said that any responsible beach renovation plan must consider both the economic as well as the functional success of these projects in the context of long and short-term scenarios. So this is why we're delighted to have Tracy begin today's summit with her impressions about living shoreline evolution, from simple stabilization to climate change innovations based on her collective shoreline experiences. I turn it over to you, Tracy.
Wow. Wow. I just broke into a sweat when I heard her say that she read my master's thesis. Thank you, Karen. And we need to talk about your hobbies that you have so we can, but anyway, can everybody hear me? And can everybody see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I thank you all very, very much. I know that I am in the presence of greatness, and I love the list of folks that are here today. So I've been asked really to provide context for the discussion today, and I thank you for that opportunity. We are at a critical point, I think, and you all are doing what we are very excited in all states to do, and that is sort of self-reflection and moving forward. So if I can just challenge us as we have this conversation today to sort of think about things maybe a little differently based on the past, and also if I can get at least one eye roll from somebody, I think I will have done my job today. So I put these two photos in my intro slide because the bottom left is a Living Shoreline project with a stone sill that we did years ago, early in North Carolina's history of living shorelines at the Pine Knoll Shores Aquarium, to protect not only a marsh, but also their infrastructure, meaning all of their intake water lines attached to a large dock. And while it's very successful, the upper right is a very recently installed innovative living shoreline project just adjacent to our stone sill. And while they're both effective from erosion control standpoint, in terms of habitat restoration, in particular oysters, they are knocking it out of the park with this innovative approach. So just shows you where we've been and where we need to be going. So living shorelines, actually, the term is going on 40 years now. It actually was coined, if I'm not mistaken, by a watershed group in the Chesapeake Bay, and my roots. And I know this because I had to track them down to ask them if we could use the term in North Carolina, because we had a term that was fairly cringeworthy at the time. And so, but I will say for those of you that are new, all of the pivotal work, all of our experience, all of the early funding mechanisms come out of the Chesapeake Bay, and in particular, Virginia and Maryland. And that gives us a great opportunity, gives you a great opportunity to really evaluate what we've learned in 40 years and what really still needs to be addressed. I chose this photo here. It's my brother's property on the Chesapeake Bay in the Northern Neck. And we installed a living shoreline project here maybe 15, 20 years ago. He has since sold the property, and maybe 5 years ago, the new owners came in and put in a full-size revetment on a portion of the project. So this project was at that time the exception and not the norm. And where I think we all want to be is that living shorelines are the norm and not the exception. So just going to run through a few sort of thoughts and context for today's discussion. So, and from my perspective, what has changed? Well, obviously research and monitoring has brought us very, very far, and we're very grateful for the research, particularly university-led research projects that have helped us really drive policy changes, but also helped us to be better practitioners. Monitoring, the same thing. We can go back and look at living shoreline projects that are many decades old now around the Chesapeake Bay and also in other states, and we can learn to design better projects. So we're very, very grateful. And there was a time when we had very little research on which to justify asking for living shorelines to be included in regulatory changes, et cetera. So state, federal, local regulations and statutes, obviously we've come very, very far. We did a analysis of state and federal regulatory methods to promote living shorelines a number of years ago, and I was very, very surprised at the outcome of that. You know, we have just from the Corps of Engineers, we've got nationwide permit 27, 14, now 54. We've got a number of regional general permits. And what's interesting is that the same regulations can be used both to promote living shorelines, but also in some cases to create impediments by their specific conditions. And I utilized my own experience. Nationwide permit 54 was adopted, however, fairly unusable in the state of North Carolina because of the specific conditions that were applied. But we have other approaches that allow it. So my point in all this is we've come a long way in regulations, but we really need to be asking the question, which is, are they actually creating a pathway where living shorelines are preferable to other approaches? Resources, tools, and technology. I'll show you one slide. If you Google living shorelines resources, you will be at it all day. And that is not, it was not the case even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Technology, same thing. With climate change effect understanding, we know that we have to be thinking not just in 2, 5, 10 years, but in 25, 50 and beyond. And technology allows us to do that. So very, very grateful for that. Engage experts. Again, all of you on this call It's amazing to me the number of engaged folks and experts around Chesapeake Bay involved in this. And for that matter, citizens groups and property owners. That is really, really key to the next one, which is an increase in the number of living shoreline projects. Again, for me, the goal for success is that we have living shorelines being the norm and not the exception. And numbers of living shoreline projects are directly involved to the numbers of all of us that are involved in every aspect of this. So funding, again, early cost share funds in Chesapeake Bay is what allowed us, when we were consultants and others, to do the projects that we did. And now there's funding, seems like in every sector, private foundations, state funding, federal funding, local funding. In North Carolina, because we're hurricane prone, resiliency funding through the legislature brought us $2.5 million last year just for living shorelines, and we have $6 million pending. So I think we're at the point now where it is the case that people understand, no matter which political leanings you're coming from, that funding for living shorelines is a win-win. And then, of course, climate is changing, and it's not if anymore, it's how much and what are the effects. And of course, I'm talking about with regard to sea level rise, with regard to living shorelines, sea level rise, and storms, their longevity, their strength, and those effects have to really be factored into all of our discussions. So I'm just showing, I Googled, as I always do, see what's new in terms of resources. And you see a number here. I'm not going to talk about these other than the upper left are spatial modeling approaches for looking at potential for living shoreline projects by our friends at VIMS there. We have a marine construction professional living shoreline training that we did this past year. All of this should be utilized. We all need to share. You've got NOAA's sea level rise mapping tool. You've got TNC's mapping tool, bottom right, in North Carolina and beyond. And then a sustainability mapping tool. And again, this is just to show you one of, 100 different tools that are available to us today that we didn't even have 10 or 15 years ago. So what has not changed? Commence with the eye rolling now. Human nature. Human nature, again, since I've looked at this and been involved in a number of different ways, you can look at that shoreline, thank you, environmental concern, for the photo in the upper right, and you can think about many different ways that you would approach this shoreline from a regulatory standpoint, from a design standpoint. But human nature is really that we're conditioned to, it's much less stressful to tell you why something isn't going to work if it's a little bit experimental, or why a regulation is the way it is. It's much easier to do that than to say, yes, but this is going to be hard, but we can do this. And so I would just, you'll see in another slide, I would just challenge us to really think about, yes, we can look at things two ways, but let's try to look at the way that gets us to the goal. Short-term planning and two-dimensional design, we're all familiar with what this means. In this context of climate change and looking forward, we do not have, and I put myself in this category, do not have the luxury of looking at a shoreline and saying, I can design a living shoreline project on this shoreline today that I feel good about for the next 10 years. We don't have that luxury anymore. Not if we want to protect the resource. And that is really what we're after here. So that hasn't changed enough. It certainly has changed some. Regulatory support, incentives, requirements, again, has changed a great deal. And we look to, you can look at other core districts. I worked in 5 core districts. You can look at those core districts. You can look at the states, and there are some great statutes and regulations that have been adopted, and we should all share those and learn from those. However, in my opinion, if what we're doing is leveling the playing field where we are making living shorelines on the same level of possibility from a regulatory standpoint as bulkheads and riprap, then we're not all the way there. I really believe that it has to be that those requirements make it easier to get living shorelines on the ground than these other approaches. And that's a personal feeling, but it's one that I think needs to be looked at. Numbers have trained everybody. You guys are knocking it out of the park around the Chesapeake Bay, but if you look at a lot of other states, including mine, we need a lot more trained consultants. Yes, that is an opportunity for folks on the line. We need more engineers. We need more regulatory folks trained, because they come in and they can't do everything at once, and they are hit with a huge number of tasks. So we need to have training opportunities for local permit officers, for your wetlands boards, for citizens. That whole thing, rising tide raises ship, I don't know what it is, rising tide raises all ships. That is appropriate here. Market forces and incentives, we know because we've done the analysis, and I've worked with a lot of contractors. The living shorelines are a great business to get into. The profit margin is high. You can feel really good about promoting them. Incentives are out there. But again, I'm not picking on you regulators. I was one. But if it is harder to get a living shoreline, the market will drive people to what is easy. And what is easy in some cases is still bulkheads and riprap or approaches. Innovation. We are seeing some incredible innovation. The bottom right photo, just to give you a small example, we did a lot of oyster bags. I mean, millions of oyster shell bags for living shorelines. And we used to do it with a shovel and one pipe. And now we, of course, we never saw those volunteers again. So we had to get up on a piece of equipment, and we created some opportunities to scale up. Of course, now we are looking at alternatives to shell bags. So that tells you where we're going. I would say on innovation, keep going, keep going. So now what? Well, as we're thinking about the context of today's discussion, I would look at this shoreline owned by my friend as really the gold standard. This is not just what we want living shorelines to look like, but it is what is already out there if we are smart enough to use it. You could have put a bulkhead in here. That big house in the background did put in a large bulkhead. It's actually more of a moat at this point. But what you see here is shallow subtidal grading into coastal marsh, grading into shrub, and I think a beautiful riparian zone. And it has performed beautifully in a number of hurricanes. So this is the gold standard, and I'd say work with nature, not against it.
Tracy, just about 1 to 2 minutes left.
Thank you. So a couple of slides just to focus us today. I would say as you move forward, continue to study the science, study projects, take these trainings, share your trainings, experiment and fail. It's really hard to fail when an agency is giving you money to do a project, but I've learned more from failures, and I've got more than a few. Failure meaning it didn't work in that set of circumstances, but we learned a lot. Share your knowledge and teach, because whether it's mentoring or projects or efforts like this is how we're all going to learn. And advocate for living shorelines now like you never have before, because if not now, then when? You can look at the data and see how many of our shorelines are already hardened, and we have an opportunity. So let's go. Here's the eye rolling. Question everything. I always say I'm not very patient all the time, but now is the time to really question not just your own. I question myself, like, why did I design that way? Why did I move in that direction as an advocate? But now's a good time to question being told no, if you will, or why do we have certain permit conditions or analysis when in fact we know that the science is driving us towards living shorelines and not away. This project that I put here, this is my last slide, was one on the Chewan River. You see it when you go over the bridge. It is a stone sill, very high energy here. There was a failing bulkhead here. We got a lot of pushback. Took us almost a year to get the permit for this. It is a freshwater system. It grades into a parking lot where we had stormwater runoff, polluted stormwater runoff going right into the Chewan River. That site now is extremely stable and also biologically extremely productive. And the folks that we worked with on this project, the state agency has now implemented living shorelines at every one of their boat ramps where they have funding to do so. So be brave, take the hit for the team, and just keep going. So now it's time for questions. I included this slide just to tell you when this house was under construction, it looked just like this. And they asked me to do a living shoreline consult. You can imagine how that conversation went. It's in an inlet hazard zone, high energy. I said, that's not possible. You should have moved your house back, or please do. And they put in a pool and this sandbag and bulkheads, which is now undermined and falling into the sound. I don't feel good about that, but point being, it's never too late. So I'll take questions or.
Great. It's never too late. I love it. Well, first, let's thank Tracy for such a great presentation. You can find the reactions button or do jazz hand or snaps, but great presentation. Thanks so much, Tracy. Not eye rolling. There is a question in the chat roll. So we welcome questions in the chat, or people are welcome to raise hands as well. There's one question, Tracy, about what is your go-to design guide or best practices book for shoreline stabilization with diagrams and photographs?
Right. I don't have a single go-to. There are many, many, many. Nowadays, the first thing that we look at are some of these models that give us what the perspective is for various sea level rise projections. And I think that's really valuable. And there are a number of them out there, of course, TNC, NOAA, VIMS has some. In your neck of the woods, you have a step further, you actually have projects that have looked at different shorelines and projected which approaches would be better. I would say my first go-to is always VIMS, and not just because they're on the line, but in fact, they have the longest history and the most, I would say, deep resource base. We've done a number of them. I helped to prepare the Living Shoreline Academy, the National Academy, Living Shoreline Academy website. It has since been taken over by Restore America's Estuaries, and it is funding dependent on whether it is still utilized. But there's two good trainings there, one for property owners and one for contractors, that at least get you started if you're new to the field. So I'd say go to who you are closest to in your state as a resource.
Great, thanks, Tracy. And Joe has dropped, Joe, is that a resource, Living Shorelines, the Science and Management of Nature-Based Coastal Protection from CRC Marine Science?
Yeah, it's a book.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, that is a very good one.
Great, thanks for that, I appreciate it. And then Amber shared the message, just reinforcing that be brave, failure is okay, necessary learning step, great reminder. I don't see any additional questions in the chat roll. We do have time for one more. If there are any additional questions, feel free to raise your hand or add it to the chat. That's great. Fred has added.
Oh, go ahead.
Can you elaborate on those two pictures in the first slide? What's the difference about the modern example versus the older example?
Go back real quick. So my point in this is that the first one is a stone sill. So again, in North Carolina and probably everywhere, stone sills are still permitted, and I don't have a problem with them, especially in high energy environments. In this case, you can't see it, but we're actually protecting all of the water intake lines for the entire aquarium, and it's on a large structure that had been destroyed in a couple of hurricanes. So it was important to us that we not mess around, if you will. The one that's adjacent is one of the innovative approaches developed by a UNC professor and an oyster grower. And it's, you can't really see it here, but they've developed a series of fiber that's encrusted in kind of a cement mixture that gets the structure up off of the ground. So there's space all around the infrastructure for this approach. So oysters attach on all sides of the structure, not just on the top and the channelward side on this, which is what we see typically on oyster sills. On stone sills and some of our oyster bag sills, is that we don't get the type of oyster restoration that we see in projects that lift them up because of increased circulation in nutrients, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just are they both successful? Absolutely. But if we can innovate and feed the restoration side of our projects, then I believe we should be doing that.
Great. Thanks so much, Tracy. Again, please join me in thanking Tracy for a great presentation. So thank you, Tracy. Really great.
You're very welcome
for our keynote today. And a lot of fodder for discussion as we move on today throughout the rest of the Living Shoreline Summit. So we have about a 2-minute break coming up now. If you see somebody that you know that you want to visit with, send them a message, send them a chat message and say, hey, let's catch up later. We will leave the Zoom room open during the few-minute break. MC, if you will share a link to the program in the chat roll again, as well as the evaluation link, feel free to go ahead and start filling out that evaluation as well. We welcome that. So we'll be coming back at about 9:51, 9:52 for after a few minutes stretch and hydration break. So we'll see you in just a couple minutes. And again, feel free to visit if you'd like. We'll see you in just a few minutes. Okay, I will come back in just about 10 or 20 seconds. So I hope you've had a chance to have some water, some more coffee or tea, and we are really looking forward to our next session. Emily Hinson's going to be introducing the session in just a moment. Again, if you have any technical troubles, MC, maybe if you can drop your cell phone number in the chat roll again, you're welcome to text Emily with questions. Thanks for that, Emily. Appreciate it. And again, we invite you to fill out your evaluation throughout the course of the summit. Super helpful. So Emily Hinson, I'll turn it back over to you to introduce our next session.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you so much to Tracy for your keynote address. I found myself taking notes on the different themes that you mentioned so that I can revisit them as I'm looking at JRA's Living Shoreline program, and we're planning next steps for the collaborative. And we'll get to hear more from Tracy. She'll be joining us for the third panel. So thank you so much for being willing to hop on that panel as well. I'm very excited for this next session coming up, Learning from the Past, Looking Back to Move Forward. We have 3 speakers who will be speaking during this panel. We will be considering lessons we can learn from the past, including Indigenous perspectives on living sustainably on the shoreline, as well as using lessons learned from prior projects to inform future design considerations for adaptation. So we will be hearing during this panel from Beth Roach of the Nottoway Indian Tribe and a staff member at the Sierra Club, as well as Tim Stromberg of Stromberg, Garrigan and Associates. But first, we have Kati Grigsby, who is a master's candidate at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, as well as she wears many hats, as well as a staff member at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. She will be speaking about her experience working with the Nansemond Indian Nation on the Matnocktown Restoration Plan, which is a science-based restoration process that evaluates the site's history, the tribal history, and the best available science to maximize native habitats, enhance coastal resilience, and reconnect the Nansemond people to the local river. I want to thank Kati for stepping in to present this. If you saw earlier editions of the agenda, we did have originally a speaker from the Nansemond Indian Nation scheduled, but they were unable to make it. And so we're so excited that we still get to hear about this project and Kati's work. And so thank you so much for sharing your work with us today. So I'm going to pass it over to Kati.
Thanks, Emily. I'm going to share my screen. Put it in presenter mode. Everybody good? Cool. So yes, I am Kati Grigsby. I am actually a part-time MA student at VIMS, and I do work full-time at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So yes, I wear a lot of hats. I was actually this past summer ERP's intern. So, you know, I just making my rounds kind of thing. My presentation today is actually my capstone work at VIMS. I'm writing a restoration proposal for Matnocktown, which is the Nansemond Indian Nation's property on the Nansemond River. Like Emily said, this plan looks at the history of the property and how that history has played a role in shaping the current conditions. And then ultimately is how we are going to look at our restoration priorities and the overall plan for restoration. But that's a lot to put into 5 to 7 minutes. So I'm going to be just talking about a little bit of the history. There's a lot of history, and maybe some of the data that I'm actually using to evaluate some of the current conditions. So let's jump right in. This property story actually starts several million years ago in the Pliocene period, when water levels were about 12 to 15 meters above current sea level. Matnocktown's current location was actually a terrace known as the Churchland Flats, and it flanked a paleo shoreline that is actually now known as the Suffolk Scarp. Chesapeake jeffersonius was a scallop species that actually dominated the intertidal waters of the Churchland Flats during the Miocene and Pliocene period, and provided calcium-rich soil needed to create tertiary shell beds called marls. These shell beds have had significant connection with the Portland cement industry, which is why Lone Star Cement Corporation chose Matnocktown as a location to actually mine the marl. This is actually a picture of one of Chesapeake jeffersonius that I actually found walking along the shoreline. It was actually inside of the berm. And funny side note, it is so prevalent in our local systems that it's actually our Virginia state fossil. So if you didn't know that, you can have that on your trivia questions later on. Lone Star Cement Corporation actually purchased the property in 1926 from a local who was actually already currently mining on the property, but the EPA actually shut it down in the 1970s. But during their time, Lone Star constructed about 11 mine spoil pits that ran parallel to a single track rail system. You can actually see it in this 1949 USGS map. And 3 of those pits are actually located on Matnocktown's part within their parcel boundaries. This is an aerial image that actually shows some of the impacts that actually happen in an overview. And then these are actually pictures of today. Actually, this is Kendall Topping. I'm not sure if she's on here, and my dog and I walking the one of the berms that actually separates the mine pit and Cedar Creek. And this is actually a picture of the wharf. One of the only two locations that actually Lone Star used to load and unload material to actually transport it over to Norfolk to actually make it into limestone. After the mine operation was shut down, the city took possession of the property and eventually turned it into a park called Lone Star Lake Park. And in 2013, the city of Suffolk deeded a portion of the Lone Star property to the Nansemond Indian Nation. They named it Matnocktown after their closest ancestral settlement, but the deed actually included a recession clause that stated that the Nansemond Indian Nation would need to construct a reenactment village on the property by 2018. Otherwise, the deed would be annulled and the city would take possession of the property. Funding, logistical issues, and safety concerns. The safety concerns actually came from relics of the Lone Star mining operation, have actually prevented the Nansemond Indian Nation from completing the reenactment village. And the city and the Nansemond Indian Nation are still trying to work through the details of that issue. But one of my goals of this restoration plan is for this to be a tool for the tribe to use to discuss with the city their priorities and their next steps and going forward. So some of the data that I'm using is actually looking at VIM's tidal marsh inventory. So there has been previous inventory that was done in 2018, but this is actually, we flew drones over Matnocktown and actually was able to get some GIS data layers to understand different plant communities and the invasive problems. We are also looking at contour data as well, looking at the various different types of elevations or potential, irregularities that have happened because of the mine operation. So you can actually see, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but this is obviously not natural. So understanding where that was and how that kind of interlaced with the mine operation is kind of what I'm looking at right now. But I'm also using the contour data to do elevations. So getting cross sections of the actual berm. You guys saw a picture of that berm. So this is actually a digital form of that. And so understanding how, if we were going to put a living shoreline on this section of the property, how to actually, do we actually remove the berm or what's protecting behind the berm? All of these various different elements are there. So trying to answer those questions. But I obviously have a lot of information and a lot of work to actually continue to do. And I'm not going to be able to fit it in right now, but I am deeply, deeply grateful that the Nansemond Indian Nation has trusted me to do that. And if you have any questions or are interested in learning more about the property or wanting to get involved, please reach out. I am going to be running to class here in just a second. So if you have questions, please feel free to email me. I'll try to stay on as long as possible, but I just also wanted to thank my academic advisor, Donna, and the professional advisor, Nikki, on this project.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. I love this. And Emily's going to be sharing a link in the chat roll to have a little bit more depth about Katie's work. So Emily, if you'll go ahead and share that, that would be great. And let's all thank Katie for a great presentation and highlights. And thank you. The actions button. We hope you have a great class, and we'll if there's anything that people have that you want to relay to Katie, we're happy to do so. So thanks again, Katie, so much. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Beth. And Beth, would you like for me to share your slides as well? Okay, great. So I'll go ahead and pull those up and turn it over to you, Beth, to introduce yourself. And if anyone has just joined, MC is probably going to mute you, but if you are able to mute yourself, that would be great. So Beth, I'll turn it over to you and share my.
Awesome. Nottoway. Good morning, everyone. Kiase Beth Roach. I am also wearing many hats, but this is an exciting morning for me because I get to wear them all at the same time and show y'all really a lot of how my journeys have all come together to speak with you. Before I get started, I would love to share with you the words that come before all else, our Ganyak or Thanksgiving address. It's something that as Nottoway people, as Longhouse people, as Iroquoian, Haudenosaunee people, this is what we are expected to do in gatherings. And it's used to bring us all together and looking through the same frame, the same lens. So Yukarihua egwehegwe one chugaktigeturad, Yukarihua inea honroach one chugaktigeturad, Yukarihua awa one chugaktigeturad. So I'm giving you the top 3 lines. I'm saying we are grateful for the egwehegwe, the people. I like to take this moment to say there's a reason why we're all on our paths. And there's a reason why we're all in the summit here together. So let's learn from each other and just take the lessons that we can from each other and be grateful. We're all coming from all different lands, all different sacred lands, Inea Hon Roach. And so we're so grateful for the lands that we all stand on, our Mother Earth. We're grateful for all of our ancestors that have traveled from many different lands. And so with that, we extend our gratitude to our Mother Earth and our awa. Of course, we all know that we cannot live without water, that it is a basic human right, and that our waters are what connects us all. And so we're also giving deep, deep gratitude to our water. Now, this address goes on and on and on. It talks about birds and trees and plants and medicines and fish and all sorts of things. And so what we hope to do is really recognize that we are relying upon all of these elements of creation. And so with that, we're all of one mind. So thanks y'all, Nottoway, for having me. I'm going to share with you a bit about my personal journey, and I'm leading up to this amazing wampum sea levels adaptation framework with an Indigenous perspective. I'm going to build that story with showing you how I got here personally and professionally. So just to introduce you to who's on the slides there, in the middle is our tribal chair, Denise Walters. That grouping of folks is their tribal council. And that's me and standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial during the Indigenous Peoples Movement March, telling a story that you will hear bits of today. So thank you. Next slide. Also, I am deep in the digital divide, y'all. So I'm keeping an eye on y'all's faces to make sure I don't freeze. If I freeze, I will come back. I just hope that it's in a flattering position. So this is a really special moment for me. I grew up in Surry County. So if y'all know, that means that the northern part of the county flows into the James River, Chesapeake Bay watershed, and majority of the county goes into the Albemarle-Pamlico watershed. So this being on two watersheds has always been very present in my mind. I grew up right on the ridge. So that means that I grew up crawling into the waters, looking at Jamestown Island. My folks lived down on the Scotland Wharf where the ferry goes back and forth. I spent a lot of my time in the water skiing, just being a river person. That's what we are. And of course, that means I also grew up in heavily contaminated waters in the 80s with the Keepone contamination and the fishing industry being shut down. Go back, slide. So I was very well aware of the environmental impacts, but we didn't know that we were environmental justice community. We didn't know these things in the 80s. We just knew not to drink the water and not to eat the fish out of the water. So in my lifetime, I have seen what can happen in an ecosystem with the Clean Water Act, with grassroots, with regulations, with nonprofits, with government will to restore an ecosystem. And that manifested after a career with state parks. I ended up being a grant manager for James River Association. And that's really where I started to pull together lived experiences of something's wrong with my watershed. How is it going to fix? I don't remember seeing sturgeon. I don't remember seeing great blue heron or eagles growing up. But of course, now y'all know those habitats have rebounded resiliently and beautifully. That bottom picture, just some throwbacks to some pictures of BJRA, including a Halloween pumpkin carving contest. Thought that might be timely. Next slide, please. So it was during those 4 years, I was there from 2014, I miss you too, Amber, to 2018. I had kept my professional identity very separate from my Nottoway native identity. Part of it was, let's be honest, y'all, DEIJ or GEID, all of these things really wasn't a part of the full-on narrative. And so it wasn't safe for me to combine those two worlds. And also we didn't have this national presence that you see now of, I'm showing you a slide from 2015, I'll touch on that, but this is before Standing Rock. And this is before the federal recognition of tribes in Virginia. We are still state recognized yet, so this is still the era though, that there were no federally recognized tribes in Virginia. So an incredible opportunity came for us to host this James River. We called it a unity walk, and it's based off a Ojibwe ceremony that's just brought to us and gifted to us by an elder, shown in that picture at the top right, Sharon Day, where it's a walking ceremony, it's a prayer. And how we do this is we start at the headwaters and we collect water in a copper pail. and you're praying for the water the whole way down. And it's a relay from headwaters down to the mouth. And with that prayer, we're saying, we want the water to be as pristine and clean and the whole ecosystem as it is now down at the mouth. So this was that first time that I was really tested. Okay, so you are a professional person, you've been this park ranger, you know how to tell stories that are very clean and not political. You know how to write grants, you know how to be in this environmental world. And yet now we're doing this really brave thing. We're pulling these stories and we're bringing them to the forefront. And it was an incredible time. It was us bringing the stories of, prehistory, which is kind of like, I hope that we get beyond that, because, history doesn't start in 1607, right? Like it starts way back before then, but we still, I think, have these colloquial terms like, forgive me, James River Association. It still irks me, founding river. I've talked to Bill Street about this. That really does exclude the presence of Native people that have been in this region for thousands and thousands of years. But these are the stories that we're trying to elevate, that it is, yes, a history of Native people, both wonderful stories of survival and, of course, terribly negative histories that have come since colonization. It's also a story of enslavement. And so the celebration of this founding is not necessarily shared with all communities. And these were the themes that we're really bringing into with this walk. I highlight Pure Fay there. We're at the James River Park System, the fall line. She said, we're walking on the moon. These are moon rocks. And she is a musician and activist. So if you want to hear some amazing Indigenous music, Pure Fay is the one to go to. And of course, that's me with Greg Richardson, or Stevenson rather. We're walking over the Chickahominy, and women carry the pail because we are responsible for that ceremony, water, and men can only carry the eagle staff. Women, because y'all know we do it all, we can carry both. So, next slide, please. So my journey has continued. Even after James River Association, I went into climate justice organizing with Mothers Out Front. I started a seed organization, Alliance of Native Seedkeepers, that looks at our traditional crops and lifeways and how do we bring that into the present and maintain and protect them. You can't put seeds on a shelf and hope they stay. We have to keep growing them, and we have to allow them to adapt to a changing climate. And I was in a couple of leadership programs. Shout out to Joe Rieger from Bean Early, my classmate. And it was during this time that I was like, okay, let's lean in heavily to what does it look like to be a full-on myself in this professional world. So that led me to this project with the North Carolina Commission on Indian Affairs, the Albemarle Pamlico National Estuary Partnership, NC State, that's Ryan Emanuel, lead researcher, water scientist, and Lumbee person. If you are not following Ryan Emanuel, please do so immediately. He's brilliant. And then William & Mary Virginia Coastal Policy Center. So this grant was written prior to COVID, and our vision was, okay, we want
Beth is frozen for me. How about others? Beth, can you hear us?
Caught the freeze.
There you are. Okay, great.
Caught the freeze. And so this grant, thanks Amber, yes, was like, okay, so we know that now there is this new narrative where we want to bring people into the conversation, but how do we do that? I mean, it's like all of a sudden nobody was paying attention to us, and then now it's like, okay, we need to do this thing, but there needs to be some buffer or some steps to get us to a really productive conversation. So the first thing we did was look at, well, what are the nuances of our territories and of our where we are? And this is the hardest part. And this is my invitation to y'all to really, investigate the histories of your areas and just, we're all on different parts of the journey here. But what's a challenge for many of us First Contact Nations is that our people have been moved around, have been removed, have been displaced, have been renamed. Some are the places they were pre-colonization, some are after. And then of course we've intermarried quite a bit. And so our ancestral heritage claims is not a linear straight line, and it's not always very clean. So, and neither of these images I think, even they don't convey what I want to ultimately convey. But what I want to show you is that there are these groupings of folks, different names, but you have on the right this is an older infographic related to the one that Kati, and congratulations, Kati, great work on her project. And so it shows these massive groups of folks at the time of colonization. And then you look to the left, and that is what the identified tribal nations are now in this area. And so you see on the eastern side, it's a huge missing piece. There's no, you don't see names, you don't see recognition statuses that have been determined. And so this has led us to really need to have a broader conversation when we are looking at practices and implementation to how do we untangle this knot that colonization has provided for us. And so we might need to skip a couple of slides. Let's go to the next one. The next few slides, if we can get to the wampum slide, I'll kind of talk through as we do. So we started this project to start these conversations. Sea level rise for us in our region is really, I think, a unique indicator for Native people is that we have always been on the waterways, we've always been on the shorelines, and so sea level rise is doing another impact of colonization with climate change. It's taking away our land in a different way. And so our archaeological resources are being threatened. You can go to the next slide. And without having protections on these lands, we're not going to be able to know our whole story and be able to connect to our whole story. And that way we're going to be losing, volumes and volumes of history if we don't marry the looking back, doing the storytelling, unpacking all these things as we carry these practices going forward. So we're going to go to the next slide.
1 minute left.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm trying to hustle through your next slide, please. So I'm here today to talk to you about this particular framework, which I'm so thrilled about, and happy to talk with anybody more about this in the future. It's called WAMPUM. It's the Indigenous Adaptation Framework for Sea Level Rise. It was developed by a Shinnecock researcher with federally recognized tribes in the Northeast region. So I can tell you it's from the source. And what they have done is helped provide, I think, a storytelling narrative, or like a way that we can kind of travel through thinking about a place or a people. What warnings, impacts have they witnessed throughout time? What ancestral teachings and stewardship practices can we pull out and apply to current situation? What kind of healing needs to happen? I think a lot of this in our particular region is this narrative shift of like, who is here? What does that look like? And what does that mean? And then it's so important for us to do this. Certainly, we're all here to protect future generations, and particularly for Native folk, if we don't have this place that we can see and feel and be a part of and be witness and co-manage, then that's a way for us to pass down our heritage. And if we don't have these places, then we lose the very fabric of who we are as a people. And y'all, we also are here in 2022, right? So this is where we are. This is the point in time in history that we're living in. And so we know that we need to unite with other communities. I love the work that Nikki has been doing with advancement with Chesapeake Bay Foundation and VIMS. The Nottoway Tribe of Virginia, we are developing a strong partnership with the Nature Conservancy. I work with the Sierra Club. I still have a contract with the DEQ. I mean, these partnerships are critical, and they take a long time to develop and build trust, but ultimately you're going to just reap many, many, many awards by taking that diligent time to really work together and find that synergy. And the last piece of the wampum framework I've had a hard time with, because at first, if you read it just from sea level rise, it says you might need to move, which retreat we all know is not what a community wants to do. People want to stay exactly where they are. I was with the Homa Nation 2 weeks ago. They're like, look, we don't want to leave. This is our home. And so there's this element of recognizing and respecting that sentiment. And I think we can add more to it. I think we can say, we want to create a movement of people that are culturally connected, that are working on these issues together. So, and then also, if we have to move somewhere, let's do it with a place that still has strong cultural connections, that we can now create a new history and a new world going forward. So I'm just thrilled that I was able to share with y'all today this wampum framework. The very last slide, and I'll just leave it for a second. It's you're going to hear a lot more about what the Nottoway tribe is doing. We have some exciting things coming up with the Nature Conservancy and some of the properties they have in our watershed. We're continuing to look at what the very, very last slide, or if it's not up there, that's okay. we are looking at what does it mean to be a state recognized tribe and work in Virginia, North Carolina. Our watershed goes over both. We have 2 EPA regions. We have a tribal consultation mandate that we're developing because the laws aren't there. We're being proactive about it. And we're out here. We're working with as many folks as will let us. And we're so excited to be on this side of the trajectory of history where we are really proactively leading what we know to be the work that we have to do.
Great, wonderful, Beth. So much richness there. Let's thank Beth for a great presentation. I'll find your reactions clap button. So Beth's email address is on this slide, and we're going to be having time for questions and discussion at the end. So thanks so much, Beth. Tim, I want to invite you to go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Right. Can everybody hear me and see my screen?
Sure can. Great.
All right.
Thanks again, Beth.
Thank you, Beth. That was a great presentation. And I think the takeaway there is people, Mother Earth, and water. And I think hopefully this project that we're working on with the Elizabeth River Project starts to scratch that surface of coming together and educating folks about, our land and our water and our environment. So let me just let's see here. So I'm Tim Stromberg from Stromberg, Garrigan Associates. We're landscape architects and urban designers. So we are the project I'll be speaking about is the Elizabeth River Project Rime Resilience Lab Learning Park. We're responsible for the site design for the project. So we've been working with Joe Rieger, Barbara Gavrin, and Casey Shaw. I think they're all as part of this call today. They're the technical experts from ERP that really supported the design team on envisioning this project. As well as Rachel Peabody from VMRC, who was instrumental in starting to help us understand the new regulations in terms of climate adaptation in our shoreline design. So looking back in history and just thinking about 19th and 20th centuries use of lands, so urban filling of our wetlands and our waterways, bulkheading. And so this former site was a commercial marina and American Legion. So as part of this process, we're working on removing those urban condition environmental constraints such as underground storage tanks, constrained soils, the introduction of the living shoreline, and removing the bulkhead, the large marina, former marina, and then removing and pulling back those urban soil conditions as part of this project site. So the project itself, the learning park is supposed to be an outdoor laboratory for community education focused on neighborhoods, residences, small business owners, to educate them about, understanding about water management and ecosystem services. And that in our built environments, that starts at the building and ends at the shoreline. So this is just a kind of a snapshot of the entire site being a BMP, and beyond the site, going into our waterways and then into our adjacent right-of-ways. So this just gives you the full makeup of what we're introducing as part of the DEQ clearinghouse in terms of a set of techniques to educate the public. So the purpose of this conversation today is really to talk about the living shoreline piece of this. So what you see in blue, so this was the design that we implemented from 2019 to the summer of 2021. So we were working with the historic standards. We invested more heavily in the low marsh zone, which is shown in blue, and had a smaller high marsh zone, and immediately going to the riparian buffer in that mix of woody and herbaceous and grass species. So that's where we were for about 2 years, and then the introduction of the new regulations said we stepped back and started looking at how we need to really think about a viable living shoreline, up to accommodate 1 to 2 feet of sea level rise. So the changes here, so the low marsh zone in blue, we're turning down the toe of that, and I'll show it in sections in the next slide. We're turning down that toe to 8:1, and we're de-investing in that zone for planned loss and migration into the high marsh zone. We're extending the high marsh zone shown in green and making it much more generous for that migration and adaptation to occur. So, and then thinking about increasing the diversity on the buffer side. So this is an outdoor laboratory, so I don't think there's going to be all the answers in this design, but what it's going to allow us to do is evaluate that migration seaward and then landward as climate change occurs from sea level standpoint, as well as storm severity and frequency. So this is just it in sections. So we're looking at the top. So this is the traditional section that is historically common in a lot of shoreline designs, where you're investing equally or at just as much in the low marsh zone as the high marsh zone. So you're starting at this specific site at elevation 0, mean high water being at 1.1, and then going up to elevation 2.5 through your low marsh and high marsh zones. And your grading is consistent, so it's a 10-to-1 slope. So these are all things that I think most folks that do living shorelines are familiar with. And then I just wanted to note the elevation of the rock sill at 2.6 feet, so 1.5 feet above the mean high water. So that's going to become a little bit more important later on the same slide. So this is looking at one section down at the bottom. This is the change. So we're turning down that toe for planned loss right adjacent to the rock sill. So that's that low marsh zone at 8-to-1, and extending that high marsh zone all the way up to elevation 4. So this is, getting pretty dry and could be influential from a freshwater standpoint, but we're creating a cross section that can adapt over time. So thinking about the migration of the low marsh zone into the high marsh, because for that planned loss in the period of years or the next decade or two. So, and the other part of this is that we had a lot of discussions around the increase of the rock sill. So this is a low energy environment. And we were thinking at one point of raising that up to elevation 4.1. So that would be a really large rock sill in its current condition. And what we landed on in the end was that that was going to be something that would have to come up with an adaptive strategy for introduction or enlargement as sea level rise occurs. So and that was primarily due to the conditions of the underground geotechnical conditions of soft clays and sediments. So what we didn't want to have is an immediate adverse effect to our adjacent property owners from a mud wave condition and the sinking of the rock sill due to its own weight. So over time, as sea level rise, that is going to need to be a retrofit. And there's a whole host of oyster technologies that ERP is going to be deploying in support of and fortification of that rock sill as part of the project. So from a planting standpoint, we took a very, very simple foundational approach to this, and assuming for species to migrate in, but we're taking 100% monoculture approach to the low marsh zone. And frankly, the high marsh zone of creating 100% coverage at 12-inch spacing for Spartina alterniflora, and then introducing pockets and interplantings of an additional 10% of other species. So we're making this, stabilizing it, creating a foundation and an environment for other species to move in and allow migration to occur. Same thing with the high marsh zone, as I mentioned earlier. So the Spartina patens is 100% coverage over that entire green space in the diagram. And then we're adding an additional 20% for pollinator species diversity. But there's the intention in just working with the design team and ARP was that we know that there's other species that will migrate in or move in on their own natural devices, but creating that foundational environment for observation and research and watching migration occur as sea level rises. So, and then, I think as just an added protection, because we are going all the way up to elevation 4 in this environment for the high marsh zone, is introducing pockets of woody materials to help within that high marsh zone to provide some additional protection and fortification in the short term until planned sea level rise occurs. So where we're investing in diversity on this project is in the buffer. We have a completely layered approach to this. So canopy, understory, woody, shrubs, herbaceous, grasses, sedges, and rushes. And I think over time, additional species will be added. But the interesting thing here is, at least in the short term, is there's going to be reverse migration of that buffer, that riparian buffer downslope towards the water in the high marsh zone until sea level rise occurs. So we're setting up an outdoor laboratory for research and evaluation to see, you know, what things are we're doing right, what things need to be changed and retrofitted long term, because the entire goal of this facility is to last 50 years in terms of a research and educational tool, to really help inform not only projects in the Elizabeth River, but just regionally in the Chesapeake Bay. So this just gives you a visual of that layered approach to species, and I'm going to spare you the details on all this, but this can be shared after the session if folks are interested. So I think the other goal, just working with Barbara and Casey, is we struggled with, you know, that purist native approach and just making sure we can get readily available species right now that we can influence homeowners to deploy locally. You know, what's readily available in the nursery industry to actually set the table and set that environment up for buffer and shoreline restoration, and not being heavily influenced on introducing species that are hard to find, but allowing them to move in their own natural devices. So, and then just, you know, looking 2050 and beyond. So we've been working with Elizabeth River Project, Wetlands Watch, on a conservation easement long-term, looking at the planned removal of some of those other urban retrofit BMPs, the migration of the buffer, and the migration of the living shoreline wetland long-term for, you know, 2050 and beyond 2 feet of sea level rise, and the planned loss of the structure, which is the Ryan Resilience Lab. So we're working on that from a policy standpoint, and hopefully is going to be an influencing factor of how we need to be thinking about slow and managed migration inland as water rises. And that's a very, very difficult topic that I think Beth mentioned, talked about quite substantially in the other call. People don't want to move where they're at, but we just need to think about how we can live better within our environment and do better things to actually improve the quality of our space and of our environment and our water. So, and then finally, just mentioning this is that the outdoor laboratory and education piece is the Boardwalk Observatory. So this is elevated above the living shoreline wetland and the buffer. So to educate homeowners, the public, and used for research and data collection. So it's completely transparent through the decking. It allows light through to ensure that that ecosystem is maintained below, but we're hoping this becomes a research engine, an observation engine, so we can actually see over the periods of days, years, and decades of that migration of the rising of the water and migration inward from a bird's eye aerial perspective that most individuals don't have the luxury of doing or visiting. They're always at either the seaward edge of the living shoreline or the landward edge of the buffer, and never understanding what's happening on the interior, the good stuff.
1 minute left, Tim.
And with that, I return that 1 minute. I'm Tim Stromberg from Stromberg, Garrigan Associates. Questions for, I guess, Beth or myself would be great. Thank you. Thank you for your time, everybody.
Great timing. That was great. Please join me in thanking Tim for another great presentation. Find the reactions button, add questions to the chat roll as well. Thanks so much, Tim. So we have about 5 minutes now for questions for Tim or for Beth, and again, we can relay things to Katie. So feel free to add things in the chat roll or raise your hand. Jim Cahoon Jim, why don't you go ahead and come off mute if you're in a place you can to ask your question, just to get some more voices in the room.
Good morning. Tim, can you comment on the maintenance plan? Because you're going to have the larger high marsh zone, and because it is an urban environment and disturbed, the risk of intrusion from Phragmites australis is always a concern. So have you started working on maintenance plans to address that?
We're going to be working with the Elizabeth River Project. I mean, I think that's the luxury of working with a nonprofit like the ERP, is that we're going to be establishing the best management practices for that maintenance. I would say, I think to your point, from a design side and not so much from a maintenance side, is that as part of the permitting, all the outfalls from the landward side is actually much lower. So the fresh water is getting inundated right at the point of where the saline water is. So there's not going to be this fresh water kind of spilling over the high marsh zone from elevation 2.5 to 4. But I think it's a very good point. And I think one of the things that Joe and Marjorie and everybody at ERP is coming up with an adaptive landscape management plan. And, you know, invasives is always a struggle, especially when you're trying to do long-term planning and planning for a condition that you're not sure when it exactly is going to occur, but you have an educated guess.
Great, thanks, Tim. And Kelsey, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if this was permitted using the regional permit 19.
17. And section 404 for the core.
Thank you.
In the weeds, good weeds there. So we're going to go ahead and launch a poll. We want to hear from folks, and then we'll have time for another question or two for our panelists. So we'd like to hear from you. And if you are joining by phone only, feel free to come off mute and share your answer in just a moment. Have you had to, can everyone see the poll first of all? Great. Have you had to adaptively manage any of the Living Shorelines projects you've worked on? And feel free to add any specifics in the chat roll. So we just would love to hear from you. The options are yes, no, I haven't encountered any, and no, I do not directly work on Living Shoreline projects. So we'll give folks just a minute to fill this out. Feel free to add any specifics about what that has meant in the chat roll, and then we'll have time for another question or so. So feel free to go ahead and enter your responses now. Anyone having a difficult time seeing it? So strange, it doesn't look like anyone's responded. Zoom just updated for me this morning, so I imagine some folks have responded to this question. Has anybody responded yet?
Yeah, we've got responses coming in.
So strange, it's just saying 0% participation, but yay for those updates. So we'll give it another 10 seconds or so for the poll question, and then we'll share the results. Get your answers in now. Yeah, I see chat roll responses. All right, I'm going to end the poll. All right, so what I see is 0% response rate in the poll. Is that what others are seeing? You're seeing something so strange. All right, well, I guess, Leah, what are you seeing for the responses here?
Sure. So 32% of people have answered yes. 16% of people have said, no, I haven't encountered it. And then 52 have said no, because they don't work on Living Shoreline projects. So 32, okay. 16, and 52.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Leah. Yay for teams. It says 0 for each of those on my screen. So I will stop sharing those results. And I see additional things. Are there any additional questions that folks would like to ask Beth or Tim before we wrap this session up? I'm just going to invite anyone to raise their hand if there are any additional questions as I look at the chat roll. See some good resources here. Right. Well, please join me again in thanking Beth and Tim and Katie for great presentations, looking back to move forward. So thank you again. Presentations are fabulous, and we will be sharing those as part of the summary and the slides. So thanks to everyone for those. We have about an 8-minute break now, and we're going to be coming back at 10:45. Emily has just shared a link to today's program and the evaluation in the chat roll. You're welcome to visit with each other during the break. We'll be coming back again in about 8 minutes. Emily Henson, anything else you'd like to share with folks before we take a break?
No, let's take that break.
Great. So we'll see everybody back at 10:45, and feel free to visit if you'd like. Thanks again, all. We'll be starting again in just about 1 minute, a little less than 1 minute. So feel free to bring your snacks back with you. All right, so if you've just joined the Living Shoreline Summit, welcome. You're in for a treat. We have just a really stellar group of speakers today, and we're really thankful for all of them. We're going to go ahead and move into our third panel now. And Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce the panel.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christine. And thank you to everybody from the last panel, Katie, Beth, and Tim. Just fantastic presentations all around. So I'm thrilled to be introducing the next panel, which is Wide Angle Lens, Designing Living Shorelines for the Future. So this panel discussion will focus on future design considerations for living shorelines, featuring perspectives from the regulatory and design fields, as well as from outside of Virginia. So first we will hear from 3 of our panelists, Neville Reynolds of VHV, Josh Moody of the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, and Rachel Peabody from the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. And after we hear from those 3 panelists, we will actually welcome Tracy Skrabal back into the conversation for some facilitated question and answer session. And then there will also be an opportunity for audience questions. So to kick it off, I'm going to hand it over to Neville, who will share his perspective on designing living shorelines with adaptation in mind.
Thanks, Emily. Are you seeing that?
Looks great.
Great. So as Emily said, looking at this through a wide angle lens and designing living shorelines for the future, I thought we might start first with looking at some history, some past projects that have been in place for many years, up to 30 years. We've experienced probably about 6 inches of sea level rise over that period of time. And I think you'll see in some of these images that these projects are very resilient. Much as Tim was talking about, it's very important to allow for upgradient migration, and just as important, migration of vegetation communities, and just as importantly, to allow that gradual gradient to dissipate wave energy, depending on the backshore conditions. This is a project, again, these are all in the early 90s, these photos that I'm going to show initially. This is on the York River. Most of these projects that I'm going to discuss are high energy environments, generally in the 10+ mile fetch range. This shoreline scarp was about 3.5 feet along here. You see broken concrete. Draw your attention to this house. This was pre-Isabel. And then the edge that was put in here, this is about 12 years after the project was constructed. This is a breakwater project with a beach fill and backshore vegetation. We have intertidal vegetation behind the structures, and you can see the new house here in the background. That old scarp from the original photo was back in this location. So very nice resilient edge that really has just matured with time. This is another project in Maryland. Bring this up because there are varied bank conditions which allow for various different types of living shoreline treatments. See a sill in this area where you have a lower backshore elevation. Then you get into higher backshore elevations here, 6, 7, 8 feet, where we use more of a breakwater and beach protection. Same in this location. And then back into a lower backshore area where the marsh and sill treatment were more appropriate. And you can see these banks in the background. This is a before picture, kind of during construction. You see how the bank's been graded back to create a smooth transition here. Some of the bank material was suitable for fill in the back shore, and then some additional sand was brought in. And then you see a photo about 4 years later. You see that nice transitional edge, the rack line. This has experienced, a high water event recently. And really this whole transitional area just really knitting together with vegetation and becoming really more robust and more stable with time. So, I think one of the things that's important to understand, just to reiterate, is that a resilient profile, particularly on a high energy shoreline, it requires gradual slopes and gradual transitions to dissipate wave energy. And that's really what dissipates the wave energy. You're going to see some structures. You have seen some structures in these photos. The structures really allow the sand planting terraces to remain in place. It's the beaches and the backshore areas and the marshes that dissipate the wave energy and limit damage to the shoreline. So oftentimes that's a balance of grading back or filling out into the water, and both of which have their limitations depending on the land use, the property ownership, the presence of existing or proposed infrastructure, and the protection or the existence of habitat in the offshore zone. So to get that protective edge, the question is, well, how high is your backshore? How do you provide a level of protection? That'll dictate how wide it is. That'll dictate the width that you need either end of the backshore. And then a big question really is, as Tracy even commented on in her master's thesis, is the economics and how much will it cost to put a transitional edge on a high energy shoreline. So again, you take a look at your design considerations, the level of shore protection, wave climate, storm surge, sea level rise, coastal processes, your bank and backshore conditions, and then budget really can have major drivers. And then the regulatory considerations, subaqueous land, submerged aquatic habitat, all these aquatic vegetation, all these things really may limit your ability to move into the offshore zone.
Is that a minute or two left?
Okay, these are just typical sections showing those transitional areas. This is a Kings Mill project, 70-foot banks here. You see the transitional banks that were established, the nice vegetation that has occurred in the backshore areas. This was after Hurricane Isabel, very little damage, little to no damage in the backshore during construction. That's well after Isabel. And you see the edge and the nice riparian buffer that has become established since then. Newer project, this is during construction further down the James. These structures are actually lower than Kings Mill. Backshore elevation is lower than Kings Mill, even with sea level rise. These compromises were made largely because of cost and that there's not infrastructure that's being protected here. So it was determined that a lower level of protection would be provided. Again, all this sand area has been planted into a nice dissipated edge to protect these banks and to protect some of the historic properties. Again, another transitional area from the Ohio Creek project. We're fortunate to work with James River project on this. Joe, I think you're on the line. This is a shot of a transitional edge and sill. There's oyster reefs in front of here. And then you have, as Tim mentioned, you've got a narrower lower marsh and about a 35-foot upper marsh transitional buffer zone to an elevation of about 6.7 to allow that upslope migration with sea level rise. And then again, kind of a softer, but not, this is on a 10-to-1 slope, moving to a 4-to-1 slope, and then to a berm feature, which protects the community back here. The berm is at an elevation 11.7 meter water. Another view of that same shoreline. So these living shoreline designs require a balance. Breakwaters, pocket beaches, marsh fringes, they all provide effective shore protection if you can balance all of the factors or variables involved. The transitional protective edge requires gradual slopes and therefore some width. So you're gonna have to have some trade-offs between offshore encroachment and upland grading. And depending on the site conditions and the budget, you may have to compromise. You may have to compromise in your degree of risk, lowering your backshore elevation. You may end up with a composite system where you have a living shoreline that is backed with kind of a last line of defense that might be a more traditional type revetment approach. And where you can strike these balances, you can establish a very nice, resilient, and sustainable estuary edge. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Neville. Thank Neville for a great presentation and framing. We'll be able to hear more from each of the speakers as we move forward today. We're going to invite Josh Moody, the Restoration Manager for the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, to go ahead and join. So thanks again, Neville, and Joshua, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me and see my screen?
We sure can, and it is still in, there you go, looks great.
All right. Well, first, I want to thank all of you for having me today. This has been just so far just an excellent array of talks, and I always appreciate hearing Tracy's perspective, especially from a multi-sector perspective in such a wide geographic range of experience, and I really enjoyed Beth's talk as well. I'm the partnership from the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. I'm the restoration manager there. So I thought I'd start out just sort of introducing you to our organization, where we work and who we are. So, we're one of the 28 national estuary programs. So for us, that's the Delaware Bay and the tidal Delaware River. So we're working with a variety of different people. We have 3 states. We have New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania. We've got EPA headquarters, Region 2, Region 3, a couple of different Army Corps districts. So there's a lot of different types of stakeholders at the table. We have a very wide salinity range, and we have a very diverse array of communities, from densely populated to very rural areas along here. That's all within this sort of purview of our work. And, being a national estuary program, we're a clean water organization. That's our mission. And so we focus really on 3 areas, directly clean water itself, healthy habitats and strong communities. And living shorelines really touch on all 3 of those areas for us. We've been, we're fairly recent to Living Shorelines. We've been working in designing, installing, and monitoring living shorelines since about 2007. So we don't have as much of a rich history as the Chesapeake, but we've really approached it from a research and academic basis. And because of that, and because of the variety of different issues, the varieties of stakeholders, as the question of what does living shorelines mean to us in our region, what are we talking about when we talk about living shorelines? It's led us down a pathway of sort of a goal-based approach to this. Living shorelines can be, utilized for a variety of different reasons. You can use them for erosion control. You can use them to build or reestablish or offset other habitat losses. Depending on your species of interest and the size of them, there can be water quality enhancement benefits. And of course, one of the major topics of today is honestly just reconnecting people with their natural heritage of being able to enjoy the water and not being afraid of it, especially in some of the urban areas. So for us, in our region, because of how, varied it is, collaboration has really, driven the development of these, of how we approach this work. So we have a few different sort of organizations that tend to come together to really collaborate on a lot of this work. There's the Delaware Living Shorelines Committee, And, in that group, we've put together a variety of different types of documents, site evaluation documents, techniques and applications. What are some of these features of Living Shorelines? What sort of materials do you use? How do those relate back to different goals you might have? And then, how do you know anything's working? Having a standardized way to try to monitor these living shorelines. In New Jersey, there's the Coastal Resiliency Collaborative. So using different tools developed there. So how do we decide where to work? And, what are the different resources that are out there? So we're not reinventing the wheel, putting together libraries of these products. And then as the National Estuary Program, we're a very monitoring, heavy organization. So we have our Mid-Atlantic Coastal Wetland Assessment Monitoring Network. What are our trajectories look like for the region? What are our targets? What are our benchmarks that we need to look at? How do we know if something's working? Having reference sites, the New Jersey DEP-led reference wetland database is helpful. And then we've developed some tools and models to help, inform work, the wetlands assessment tool for condition and health, which is WATCH, and the Living Shoreline Feasibility Model, Marsh Future Net Mapper. And it's great. You can develop all this stuff. But what is really needed is you've got to network them. They all really need to work together. And that's something that our area or our region has been putting a lot of time and investing a lot of resources into. Again, a lot of states, a lot of committees, a lot of people. We don't really want to be reinventing the wheel, especially around a shared natural resource. We're all around the Delaware Bay and the Delaware River. We need to be looking at things and we need to be sharing a language. So a lot of this has gone into creating these sort of integrated pathways that kind of get at these 5 topics. Where do we work? How do we really know what the problem is in these different areas? What are my design considerations? And what are going to be the effects of tactics on the landscape? And are they working? And so that is really where we have spent a lot of time developing these tools, developing these resource guides, and then trying to create a pathway for people to move down. And so where does that take us for the future? So, for us to design for the future, we're thinking about where and how these shorelines are meeting these variety of goals. So, these developing goals for monitoring plans, these different tools, deciding where to work, they all start with an idea of what's your goal. Maybe it's an agency-based mission. Maybe you're a landowner that's losing land. Maybe you have particular species of interest that is part of the mission of your organization. But deciding what different areas fit your goals and what different tactics get to them is really a common feature across these tools. And it's also moving beyond these static definitions that are like living shorelines, a configuration of materials that's put on the ground in a specific location. For us, it's becoming living shorelines a verb. It's active. It's a measure of a level of function. You can construct a bunch of stuff and put it on the ground, but it may not function as a living shoreline for a few years. And that's okay. The question is, how is your trajectory getting there? And if it's not, well, what's standing in its way? And that's really where having all of these guidance documents and tools that kind of work together allow you to step back and forth in time along this process and ask ourselves, if we're not meeting our goal, where is it going wrong? Where is the function, the connectivity missing that would allow us to do that? And then, of course, allowing us to have this standardized tracking and adaptive management. If we're not successful today, are we on a trajectory to be successful tomorrow? And, really tempering that word failure. The only time something's a failure for us is if we're not understanding why it's doing what it's doing. That is a failure because it's a lack of action on our part.
But 1 more minute.
Got it. This is the last. This is it. So where are we going with the future design? And really to touch back on some of, Neville's language that you just used with space balance and trade-offs. I mean, we're really going, it's the habitat mosaic. How are things going to naturally shift? Are living shorelines meant to hold the line like a wall, like a bulkhead? I mean, not really. That's not really something we could expect naturally. So these integrated spatial designs that move beyond single species and single habitat focus. And really the regulatory nexus for us is all along that entire pathway, having the regulatory agents be a part of the design of these tools. So we're making sure that as people are using them, the outcomes of them are understandable to different regulatory agents. So you can use these different tools, the tables, and the different things they provide. They have meaning and they're understandable outside of just those of us who are sort of entrenched in this kind of work. And so with that, I will turn it back over to you, Christy.
Great, thanks so much, Dr. Moody. Feel free to go ahead and share that last slide. We'll include it with the links at the end. So let's thank Dr. Moody for a great presentation again. Thank you so much. Invite folks to stretch. I saw someone stretching, really great. So we're gonna keep diving in deeper. You know, this is really, we've had so much excitement about this conversation. I see there's one question in the chat roll. Feel free to add them. As we continue to move forward, you're going to be able to hear more from the panelists. They're going to be responding to some specific questions soon. I'm going to go ahead and invite Rachel Peabody of the Virginia Marine Resources Commission to join. Rachel, looking forward to hearing from you, and I'll turn it over to you. Thanks again, Dr. Moody.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen really quick.
Great.
Okay, thanks for having me. I'm Rachel Peabody. I have a new position here at the VMRC, Director of Coastal Policy with a focus on restoration and resilience. So one of my long-term goals here at the VMRC is to start taking a lot of these conversations and building a resilience and restoration office that's really focused on the resilience of Virginia's tidal natural resources. So today I'm just going to discuss a little bit about some of the changes that we've seen from a regulatory perspective in Virginia on incorporating living shorelines into our regulatory process and some hopes for the future. So, so Virginia is managed in pieces on the tidal shoreline. And the VMRC manages the tidal wetlands, so from mean low water to 1.5 times tide range. And as we know, especially now, that this area of shoreline is not static. However, the regulatory and the regulatory process and the jurisdictions for that is static. So what Virginia has been wrestling with for the last few years is how do we build a regulatory process that can adapt as sea level rises or as shores change to incorporate a process all the way across the landscape. So we've been managing tidal wetlands since 1972. And I know this is a lot of writing, but the goal is to preserve the wetlands and to prevent their despoliation and destruction. And in 2020, the legislator decided to further that concept with adding to our definition of what the VMRC should be doing. And they added that we should ensure protection of shorelines and sensitive coastal habitats from sea level rise and coastal hazards. So it is now a part of our job to, as we're thinking about how we manage shorelines and how we review designs that sea level rise and coastal hazards are incorporated into that process. So in 2016, we first came up with, or we first incorporated living shorelines into code by saying living shorelines were the preferred method for shoreline stabilization. But in 2020, we had Senate Bill 776 that changed that. And it changed living shorelines to be the default approach to shoreline stabilization, unless the best available science indicates the site is not suitable for such methods. So this was a big shift in thinking, in that from a regulatory perspective, there were, we wanted living shorelines, but we did not say they had to be there. So now we're saying that it is the default approach to shoreline stabilization. 2020 legislative session also told us that we needed to incorporate the definition of sea level rise and coastal hazards into our guidelines, and that we needed to develop an integrated guidance for the management of tidal shorelines systems. Again, thinking about how can we make sure that the VMRC guidelines are consistent with the DEQ and the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Guidelines. So in 2020, we updated the tidal wetlands guidelines. So we updated it based on the best available science that was given to us by the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. We communicated that in these new guidelines that living shorelines are the default approach to shoreline stabilization. We incorporated the concept of ensuring protection of shoreline resources from sea level rise and climate change. And I will say that when you read our guidelines, this is the first time any states have tried to incorporate shoreline protection into static kind of regulatory structure. And so you'll see the concepts weaved through there. We intend for the guidelines to be a living document that as we learn more, as we shift conversations, that the guidelines will shift with them. As we run into problems through the regulatory process, the guidelines should shift with that. And then again, we identified shoreline management approaches for those approaches where a living shoreline isn't suitable. So this is just kind of a flow chart that says living shorelines must be the first approach to shoreline management in any type of application. If it's found that a shoreline is not suitable, then rock revetments are the next preferred alternative. And then when a rock revetment is the preferred alternative, we should incorporate living shoreline concepts as much as possible. So as we've been weaving through the guidelines, the concept is resilience of tidal wetlands over time. And so in that, we know that tidal wetlands are going to need to shift landward, even though our regulatory jurisdiction is not changing now. We need to evaluate the project based off of its ability to move later. So the guidelines and our current code says proposed projects must allow the landward migration of existing vegetation using the 2017 NOAA Intermediate High Projection Curve. This is a big concept that still has a lot of fleshing out to do, and how do we manage this from a regulatory perspective, but also how do we design for this? So there's a few tools that are out there now. Adapt Virginia has this concept baked in where you can choose the 2017 intermediate high, and you can see where the projected water levels are going to be based off of where they are now. And you can start to design your elevations based on that. There's also a few other resources that I have on this slide here that can help a designer get to that concept.
1 to 2 minutes left.
Thank you. So the guidelines now also say projects should be designed to mitigate coastal hazards over the useful life of the project. So the goal there is to design the project for what you know is going to be the biggest hazard that is in the life of the project, so that we're not trying to rebuild something over and over. We say projects should ensure that the stabilizing objectives address the most erosive conditions as well. And it recommends using the 10-year storm event water levels as calculated by NOAA and FEMA in order to do that. So the guidelines have a little more work to do in preparing the user on how to do this. That's one of the goals that I have in my office, to start building some more guidance on how exactly are we supposed to evaluate the 10-year storm and put it into project approaches. And most recently in 2021, there was some recent legislation that redefined living shorelines. And the goal of the framers of this legislation was to give a little bit more flexibility onto what a sill should be. And they added the terms other structural and organic materials shall be appropriate in living shorelines. So take a look at that as well. This has not been updated into our guidelines yet, but we do intend to put these in our guidelines. And the goal was that instead of just using rock, a designer would have the capability of using other type of prefabricated materials or nature-based materials in addition to our typical structures that we see. So what's next for incorporating resilience and sea level rise into living shorelines into the regulatory structures? VMRC and DEQ are going to continue working on integrated design guidance that incorporates both of our jurisdictions The DEQ is currently working on updating their guidelines to incorporate living shorelines and resilience into those. They just finished their public information portion and are actively taking those public comments and trying to incorporate them into those guidance. VMRC will be targeting federal funding to aid private property owners in living shorelines and resilience projects. So how can we offer more of a carrot to designers and to private property owners to incorporate that onto their own properties? And then again, another goal is to create additional guidance on designing for the 10-year storm event. So that was a very quick overview, but plenty to discuss later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Please join me in thanking Rachel for another great presentation. It's great to hear about what's coming down the pipeline on the horizon at VMRC. So thanks, Rachel. So we have questions for our panelists. First, we want to hear a little bit from you, each of you. So Leah, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and launch the next poll that we have. Has the new regulatory framework impacted your day-to-day life? And we invite specific ideas in the chat roll about how that might have looked, and then we'll be turning it back to our panelists, inviting Tracy back up for responses to a few questions, and then broader question and answer. So Leah, is that launched already? So I'm going to turn it over to you, Leah, actually to go ahead and just facilitate this. We'll give people just a moment to fill it out. Can everyone see it? Okay, great. So feel free to add specifics to the chat roll. We'll give you a minute to fill it out. All right, about another 10 seconds or so, and Leah will be sharing the results as well. And we welcome specifics in the chat roll too. Okay, Leah, you want to go ahead and share the results and walk us through what they are?
Yeah. So I'm not sure, can people see those results? And then for those of you that might not be able to, so 16% said yes, a lot, yeah, 41% said somewhat, 24% no, and then 19% perhaps not sure.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Leah. So it's a changing landscape, changing world, and it's going to be, that question will be different in 1 year and in 5 years and moving forward. So thanks, Leah, for that. So the first thing we want to do is to ask a couple key questions of our panelists, and I invite our panelists to go ahead. I have each of you pinned. If you're able to share your screen when you're ready to, your video when you're ready to, feel free. I'm going to pose 2 questions. I'll let you know who's going to be going, and you'll have 3 to 4 minutes to respond, and feel free to respond to the question that makes the most sense to you and your work. That might be your master's thesis, that might be your current professional work today. So however you adapt, you respond to this question, feel free. Tracy, we're going to start with you, and thanks again for joining again. The questions are the same for each of you. And again, you'll have 3 to 4 minutes each. So first, how do we collectively need to adapt what we're doing to the regulatory framework in Virginia? How has it impacted your day-to-day work? Second, how can designs be adapted to the new regulations for a changing climate, sea level rise, developing solutions, and adaptive management? And Emily Carlson, if you could go ahead and drop those 2 questions in the chat roll as well so that our panelists have them available, that would be great. And Tracy, I'll turn it over to you first to respond in 3 or 4 minutes. And thank you again.
Welcome. So I'm uniquely qualified in that I have not worked with these regulations. Yay. However, I've read them. I read the 2015 changes, 2017, and then the recent ones. And so as an ex-regulator and then all the other perspectives, I would say this, that how regulations are actually utilized on the ground depend on who's sitting in those chairs, who's sitting in the chairs of the wetlands boards, who's sitting in the chairs at VMRC. And Rachel, your work is so important, and thank you. It was a great presentation and I applaud your efforts. So as I'm looking at this, I can look at these strategies, the criteria and the rationale, and that is fantastic that you have written word to justify when you have to say no, when those people have to say no or go back to the drawing board. And that is the hardest thing as a regulator, especially if you're not a full-time regulator. If you're a wetlands board member, if you're and you are really having to make a tough call, to be technically trained enough to feel that you can say no to a powerful influence and a lot of money pushing for something else, it's really, really difficult. So I applaud you. This language is great. What I would recommend, or you're already doing, is you've got to provide education and keep talking to all of the decision makers and sort of making sure everybody's on the same page with the initial goal, which is commitment to living shorelines being shall be used, not the preferential. That's a huge step, and the hardest shift to make, I think, is that it is going to be what we call that hierarchy of decision making. I wrote those rules in Delaware 100 years ago, and it had a hierarchy. It was great for a while, and then the precedent moved away from that. So what happens in terms of implementation of this as a precedent is key, because once the loopholes are, I would say, allowed or advantaged, it's very difficult to then turn the train. So I applaud you, and I'd say education and outreach and helping decision makers to feel committed and passionate is key.
Thanks so much, Tracy. We're going to go in the reverse order of our presenters initially. So Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you to respond to the questions next. They're in the chat roll, and if you'd like for me to say them out loud again, just let me know. So thanks, Tracy, and Rachel, over to you.
Thanks. So I'll start with one. How do we need to adapt what we are doing to the regulatory framework in Virginia? So I'm learning as I've been in this spot a little longer, that sometimes it's a little bit easier to talk about living shorelines as just this general concept, just like when we talk about resilience or sea level rise, and forget to talk about the important details in those, and that just like climate change, living shorelines can become more of a political term rather than a technical term. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do a better job at is when I speak about shoreline stabilization, and I think Neville is very good at it, is talking about the technical details that make it work, and sometimes getting away from the overall perspective of why we like them. And it doesn't become such a political conversation anymore. So I think what I'm learning is, and how do we adapt to what we're doing, is making sure that our vocabulary is specific and not overarching, so that we don't lose people. And how can designs be adapted to the new regulations? You know, we have a lot of tools coming, and one of the things that I've been noticing is there's lots of tools coming our way. So one is learning the new tools, and that, you know, NOAA has a new tool and VIMS has a new tool, but starting to really dive into those and getting a better understanding of your project from a technical perspective. Also, designers and applicants are really going to need to have a better understanding of elevation and how to get elevation on site, because this is something that you need to know your elevation now, and you need to know what you're designing towards, and being educated in that is going to be key to a good design, long-term design. So I'll stick with that for now, and then we'll come back.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Joshua, over to you. 3 to 4 minutes. Pick your question or questions.
Okay. Well, you know, I'm in a similar position as Tracy, you know, but so I'm not familiar, and I'm not, you know, have to interact with these particular rules, but, you know, up in our area, you know, we redid the New Jersey Coastal Zone Management rules in 2021. There's the New Jersey Protecting Against Climate Threat rules that are coming out. There's the Delaware Statewide Action Authority that's been a part of. So, you know, everyone in every area that's involved in this work kind of goes, you know, there's this process. So, you know, one of the things, and there's the point in time before the rules are in place, and then there's responding to rules once they get in place too. So I think one of the ways that we've been actively involved in this is it's the developing of the relationships really is what's key. So that way, before, as rules are being developed, and there's all like the committees and the meetings on the New Jersey Pact rules, you know, people are already sharing a common language. But the question is, how do you develop that common language between sometimes what is seen as like two different sectors that are, you know, not, or that may be opposed to each other, which isn't the case at all. And so a lot of that has to do with, you know, these committees that I've mentioned before. You know, we spend a lot of time having multi-sector representation on those committees and having smaller subgroups that contain representation from across those committees to get those conversations going and facilitate those relationships. The tools and the documents that we develop, every single one of them has key regulators as part of the review committee and part of the design of the committee. What needs to come out of them that we need to provide to regulators, and what is the language that we need to use so it fits in with the way that things are currently being looked at? What should also we put in there, because what is the talk of how things are moving towards the future? What can we start to introduce, open the door with a little bit? And, you know, how can we present, you know, ecological trajectory results that are understandable, and how can they be summarized graphically with these tools so they can be included not only like grant applications, but also in permit applications? And do they have a direct connection that if somebody, say, uses the watch tool to identify what the problem is on the site, and the regulator who's reviewing it might be like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense, they know who they can talk to about that. Like, listen, I got this thing that came across my desk and I don't know, what do you think? Does this make sense? So having those relationships in place, I think, has been very helpful because it keeps that line of communication open. And then once rules are in place, I think Tracy's right, you know, who's sitting in the chairs makes a difference, but it's also about the credibility of your organization. And if you show that you are interested in, well, you can listen as well as, you know, you can promote your project, but you can also listen and incorporate feedback. It can be actually a part of the discussion, and that, you know, no one's looking to do any harm. The regulations are in place to prevent harm. Practitioners don't want to do harm, but there has to be, you know, a place to come together and to compromise at some points in time. And so it's really those relationships that kind of keep all of that going. So that's how we have been, you know, spending time, you know, working with the regulatory sector. And in terms of adapting, you know, projects for changing sea level rise, or as new information comes in, and maybe how can we change a project design that's been permitted, but now we sort of need to do something else to adaptively manage it. You know, again, it's who's sitting in the chair. Do you have that established relationship? And do they know that what you're doing, even if it's maybe outside of the regulation, if it's within the spirit, there's room for a conversation? And so I think relationship development is really where is worth the investment. So
thanks so much. Neville, over to you.
I think on the first one, we really haven't been strongly affected by the regulation. Most of the work that we do has been for folks that are enthusiastic about living shorelines and want that more natural edge on their, you know, as their shore protection for any number of reasons. You know, I will say one area where we see a potential for conflict moving forward is in the more industrial sites, marine terminals, areas where the actual function of the property on the waterfront may not lend itself, in fact, may be in complete, you know, conflict with a living shoreline approach. And I think that's the one thing that kind of jumps out about the mandate for a living shoreline. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't, you know, segments of the shoreline where living shoreline can be incorporated, and we've been able to do that on a number of sites. But you could see a traditional, you know, in a traditional marine terminal or other type of waterfront industry, you could see where that might be in conflict. And I think that that's not the intent, to force something into a situation or into a landscape position or land use where it maybe is just not completely appropriate. You know, I think on number two, how can our designs be adapted? You know, just listening to Rachel's talk, and the importance of that elevation. I mean, you really have a couple of things going on here, and it's really all about what's the character of the land, what's the land use going to be, because these living shorelines, I mean, they can be flooded. They're fine being flooded. The Kingsmill project was 4 feet underwater, you know, during Hurricane Isabel, and it did fine. It's what's in the backshore, you know, can it dissipate the wave energy? Is the wave energy dissipated before it gets to it? And if you don't have that land area, if you don't have that space where you have an abrupt change in elevation from the shoreline to the upland, how do you deal with that transition? And that I think is the challenge, and that you may end up with you know, a combination of things. And it's, you know, if it needs to be so high, you know, 2-3 feet above the 100-year floodplain in some municipalities now, that's a huge obstacle to overcome. And you're probably talking about, you know, vertical walls and all the things that we don't want on the shoreline. And the key is to get them back far enough that you can have a transitional edge before you have to raise grade that much.
Great, thanks, Neville. We have another moment or two before we go to the questions from participants. Are there any additional responses from panelists to your co-panelist comments or to the questions?
Yeah, I have two. Josh, the partnership building is absolutely huge, and that was a good point. As a previous regulator, I would have projects come in from people I knew I could trust, that I knew designed well or would listen to my concerns and would be able to adapt to those concerns. So it really is important building partnerships with the regulators and with designers. And then also the concept that always comes to me when I talk about resilience and I talk about living shorelines is that we're not trying to beat flooding through building a living shoreline, and that there is a difference between a resilient shoreline and a resilient wetland and stopping flooding. And that, you know, in our brains, we need to make sure that when we're talking about a design and a project and something along the coast, that we differentiate between those two concepts.
And Christine, I'll just add, I agree with Rachel about that, but what I have noticed is when we try to talk to towns or elected officials about living shorelines and the benefits, we don't get tossed out of the room like we used to when we mention sea level rise, because they are really in a tight place with regard to daytime flooding and lots of problems with that, if not directly affected by living shorelines. Certainly there is a nexus of common interest that oftentimes we can assist them with. So I would say resilience is an opportunity for us to, you know, and we do a lot of talking about the financial implications of not doing this. And that's important to everybody. I don't talk about birds and bunnies anymore because not going to gain any traction there, but talking about real things like financial implications has been really helpful in that relationship building.
That's about another minute or so. Go for it, Josh.
That's an interesting comment, and I don't know. Up here, a lot of municipalities and townships and people are interested in hearing any sort of idea. But one of the interesting disconnects, that's at least because of the good relationships and active conversation between regulatory and practitioners, is, you know, this historical, like you treat the shoreline or you treat the platform, you treat the upland or you treat this, and there's these imaginary lines between everything. And it can be very expensive permitting. It can take a long time permitting. You could have to go down multiple different pathways. And so this idea of like, how do we develop permit links between like edges and platforms, because that invariably leads into the multi-species focus as well. Because at the edge, people might be talking about oysters and shellfish, and in the high marsh, we're talking about sparrows, and now you got conflicts. So this idea of the habitat mosaic, this interconnected pathway across the spatial spectrum that needs to be addressed regulatorily, but then also by the different agencies. You know, U.S. Fish and Wildlife has got certain, you know, things they're interested in, National Marine Fisheries Service. How do all those groups come together, and how do we create that connectivity? And I'm sure is with you a very long conversation, but a very necessary one.
You know, Joshua, to that point, I would say that our conversations recently, and perhaps the most challenges that we have been more with the federal agencies about establishing this edge. And it's exactly what you're talking about. It's these hard lines that are in there. And, as I discussed earlier, you've got to get this, you have to get this transitional edge in somewhere if this is going to work. And, sometimes that means encroaching on a shoreline habitat that's not really, is degraded, and it's not providing the function that it could if you put some sand fill in, for example, and get the right slope, get the right grain size, get the right backshore elevation. And you're doing that at the expense, perhaps, of intertidal zone, but you're displacing that intertidal zone channelward, but you're also giving that marsh that continuum of marsh and buffer an opportunity to move up gradient with sea level rise that may not be there without this. And it's hard for some of the regulators to kind of get their accounting down for something like that. We are seeing comments for the first time in 30 years from the EPA asking us to what are our avoidance and minimization steps on the shoreline? I mean, it's a shore protection project. And, yes, there's an explanation for it, but by definition, it's in the wetland. So there is a lot of education to go on. And I think willingness to get outside those kind of rigid regulatory boundaries and be more receptive to, okay, this is creating a better edge. It may not be a, perfect accounting, but there's got to be some credit for reestablishing that transitional zone.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Neville. There are some great questions and feedback in the chat roll. We're going to transition now to about 10 or 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So some of the questions are to specific panelists. So Kelsey, if you'd like to come off mute and pose your question to Neville, feel free. And then if you have additional, just to invite feedback, commentary, ideas that you'd like to add to this really rich discussion, feel free to use the chat roll for that too, as well as resources you'd like to share with others. So Kelsey, are you able to unmute and share your question for Neville about Carter's Grove?
Yeah, sure. So Neville, you actually kind of touched on this just a little bit just now. But I was wondering at Carter's Grove, where the structures are appropriately pretty far from the existing shoreline, did you experience regulatory pushback regarding filling in the state waters in order to put the structures adequately far from shore?
Not really, not on that project. We provide an explanation for it. We've got examples of the relationships between the structures and the beach widths and justification for the level of protection provided by the system. And that one actually was fairly, we didn't have any pushback, particularly from the state. Where we did have some debate on that project was actually with DHR from a cultural landscape standpoint. And interestingly, there was support for a living shoreline at Carter's Grove. And the notion of that support was marsh plantings on that high energy shoreline. So a very minimalist approach on that shoreline that would not have really, well, it wouldn't have survived. So we did have to walk through some of that kind of the coastal processes element of that discussion in the regulatory process.
Thank you for that. The next question, I don't think the person who asked the question is still in the group, so I'm just going to pose it. And it's a question for the group and particularly VMRC. So Rachel, why do JPA, and feel free to translate this question, Rachel, if appropriate, more broadly, why do JPA applications not include submitted surveys aligned for the 1.5 mean high water mark as an application requirement? They show all the mean low water and mean high water, but also 1.5x mean high water, which should be required in all surveys and cross sections. Rachel, I'll turn it over to you for that one.
Yeah, I'm gonna look. I thought it was on the list of things that are required in the JPA. If not, then it's something we should definitely change, because as a regulator, we always required it if it was applicable to that particular project. I guess an overarching concept though is that the joint permit application and the associated drawings were intended to be done by anybody. Anybody could apply for them. So one of the difficult things that we're running into is as shoreline design becomes more complicated, or the requirements become more complicated, how much regulatory burden are we putting on the applicant or the homeowner to turn in a joint permit application, or even a small firm on, can they do those surveys and things of that sort. So trying to find that happy medium between a very technical survey that's due as part of a joint permit application and a line drawing by a homeowner is sometimes tough. As for the specifics of the 1.5 times tide range, if it's not there, I agree it should be there.
Right, and Allison said it's in the guidelines for sure. Pam has said it's required. The vegetation criteria serves as the tide range, so at the bottom in the chat roll. So thanks for that. Okay, Kelsey, would you like to ask the next question to Rachel?
Sure. Sorry, I have a lot of regulatory questions today. So I know that there was an SPGP that was recently public noticed. I was just wondering how that will relate to the regional permit 19. Not sure if you know this or not, Rachel, but will they coexist? Will the regional permit 19 expire in 2023 and not be renewed? How will those two relate to each other?
Great. Could one of you define SPGP, please?
The State Programmatic General Permit. I think that's what it stands for. Yeah.
Yeah, I honestly don't know, Kelsey. I've been out of the game for a little bit, but also the federal rules don't go past me. So I'm very specific to the state rules, but it's something that I need to understand, or that we all need to understand. So I can't answer it other than say that I can look into it.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any other responses from panelists to any of the questions that have been posed so far? Pam, do you've shared some good feedback in the chat. Would you like to share anything? Just invite you're welcome to unmute if you'd like to share anything. And we do have time for a few more questions if anyone else would like to add them to the chat roll or raise their hand. I guess first question is, Pam, would you like to share anything? Great.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so the SPGP is a negotiated process between the Corps and the state. And so DEQ is responsible for that part of the regulatory process. And it has to do with the 401 certification for 404 permits. So to the extent that in Virginia, the tidal wetlands permit issued by a board or the commission, if there's no board, is considered the state permit, it just gets carried along. And so the VMRC is not, as far as I know, actually active in that negotiation.
Great, thanks, Pam.
Sure.
So I don't see any additional questions. Are there any more questions? Here's another one. Awesome. All right, Fred has asked, interested to hear. Fred, do you want to come off mute and ask this question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was just curious about the 10-year design storm that VMRC is considering adding to the regulations. I was just curious about why that design storm and not something else. And is it an industry standard that's used in these types of projects?
Yeah, so the 10-year design storm has already been included in the guidelines. And that was based off of feedback during the public interest review. But one of the reasons why I mentioned it was because I've been hearing a lot of questions and concerns about whether that's the most appropriate thing to use and how to use it. So it's there, but I would like to kind of dig into that concept a little more from an agency perspective and make sure we're really understanding what we have recommended as well as how to apply it.
Yeah, is that like a water level or is it a wind
think
event or is that kind of what you're getting at, is what you really mean by that?
Yeah, so FEMA, it's a very specific to FEMA and the 10-year design storm that FEMA uses for their regulations. So each city has that in their FEMA planning document that can be used for design. So I will send that to you if you'd like. I have a kind of a one pager on how you can search for it and use it. If you don't mind, just if you put your email in the chat, I'll go ahead and send it to you.
Oh, thank you.
Of course.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to invite each of our panelists to share just in a phrase, kind of what's your hope for, not even sentences, but designing living shorelines for the future. What's your hope for the future in a phrase about how more broadly, East Coast seaboard, or however you take that, we can design living shorelines for the future in a phrase. That's tricky. Who wants to start?
I will, and I'm just going to I'm going to focus on policy. We got a lot of technical people here. I think you've got great language in Virginia and Maryland. You've got great regulation. The challenge that Neville mentioned about resource agencies and this conversation where we focus on narrow ecosystems and that habitat trading is as valid today or as challenging today as it was 40 years ago. So we really need to focus on the fact that here's what we know that we didn't know then. If you're looking at shallow subtidal, SAV zones, intertidal, coastal marsh, and upland as your habitats, what is most at risk is that intertidal coastal marsh connection that Neville talks about. And we really, really have to stop focusing on narrow ecosystems or we're not going to succeed.
Great. So big picture thinking as connected ecosystems, building relationships are some of the themes I've heard. Thanks, Tracy. Yeah. In a phrase, your hope for the future for designing the living shorelines for the future. Who's next in a phrase?
I'll go next, but I want to do two, like one from two different perspectives, because sometimes it's hard to figure out how to integrate those perspectives. So ecologically, it would be very easy, habitat mosaics, connectivity. And then, but it's really about the community. So I'm sort of split on either using listening or relationship building, getting back to Beth's talk earlier, some of the comments that, Tracy and Rachel had, listening for a community and then mosaics for application.
Great. Love these phrases and words. Thank you so much, Josh. Rachel, Neville, a phrase for the future?
That's a good question. I'd like to see additional options that make it easier for a homeowner to choose living shorelines. And so for the future, I'd like to be a part of that process and giving additional carrots and assistance for helping people choose to go that way.
Great. Thanks so much, Rachel. Neville.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question and really good answers, but, not to beat a dead horse here, but I think that the definition of a living shoreline needs to be expanded to, I think, speak more directly about that transitional estuarine edge. And we've done it. There's the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. There's all the wetlands acts. There's the importance of subaqueous lands and submerged. It's all there. It's just someone trying to tie that together. And that goes the same for the regulatory process too, because having one regulatory process that acknowledges the benefits or where those impediments are maybe reduced a little bit it checks off a list, but it's still an impediment. And trying to get some consistency across the state and federal agencies as far as this issue goes would be huge.
Great. Consistency. Absolutely. Building on connections, mosaic, carrots, and relationships. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a really rich session and discussion. Thanks so much to each of you. Greatly appreciate your time. So thanks all. All right, so here we are getting ready to close out, and Emily Hinson has some great information about what's coming up next. Emily Carlson, if you could go ahead and share the evaluation in the chat roll again, that would be great. And Emily, I'll go ahead and share my screen for that last slide and turn it over to you, and then I'll give folks information about how the breakout rooms are going to work, which is with lunch. So Emily, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you to Neville and Rachel and Josh and Tracy for that panel. That was a really fantastic conversation. And thank you again to all of the presenters who shared their expertise with us today. Before we adjourn, I wanted to highlight a couple upcoming Living Shoreline Collaborative events. We do have, I'll mention it again, the field trip that is part of this summit that is scheduled for tomorrow in Williamsburg, and it will be highlighting the area around Jamestown Island as an area where these themes of adaptive management are being considered alongside public access and cultural resources. So we hope you'll join us. I mentioned this before, but I will be closing registration for that field trip this afternoon. So if you're not already registered and want to join, please do submit another RSVP, as soon as you can. There are a couple spaces left on that field trip. We do have a couple of Living Shoreline workshops, and there's another slide that shows that we don't have to switch yet, but I might pass it over to Shireen or Stacy, not to put you on the spot, but they can speak so much better to those workshops than I can. But we'll share that in a moment. I think Emily shared this in the chat, the link to sign up for the Living Shoreline Collaborative newsletter to stay up to date on all of this, all of the above and more. I just, before passing it over to the training team to talk about the upcoming workshops, I wanted to once again reiterate my thanks to all of the speakers and panelists, the steering committee for guiding this summit. We've been talking about it since like March or April, I think. So, it's been a long time in the works, and specifically the summit planning team who have spent time, shaping the event and helping to select panelists. And once again, Dialogue and Design for creating that backbone of organization that makes everything go off so smoothly. So with that, Stacy or Shireen, would you like to share about the upcoming workshops again?
Yes, so first of all, that site assessment, etc. workshop that was listed for February, the name is changed. That's the Essential Skills for Living Shorelines workshop in March. And so I apologize, but our registration is not open yet on cblpro.org, but please send me or Stacy your name and interest, and we'll make sure you make the list. And just as a general description, our goal is really to provide experiential learning process and professional development process where we'll go from site assessment and to planning and design to developing a permit application, and then construction and maintenance, as well as monitoring, integrating that monitoring needs into Living Shoreline projects. And so, and then in order to earn a certificate through this Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program, we are asking people to get some installation experience by volunteering at some dedicated Living Shoreline installations where we'll have professionals leading volunteers, professional volunteers and citizens, but also providing extra information and knowledge to professionals, like we did with the one in April that Jim Cahoon led. So I just wanted to invite you to contact Stacy or myself. We put our address, emails in the chat several times, and we'll make sure you know about when these Workshops are open for registration, but we'll make sure you get on the registration list too, so you get priority.
Great, thanks so much, Shireen. And it's a great example of what's happening outside of just this space. So if you have not joined an action team and you'd like to, they're open. There's information on the website to learn more. You're welcome to join the newsletter to learn more as well. We do invite you to please fill out an evaluation. Here's what's going to happen after just a few-minute break. This is just the time for those folks who can't make it to the field visit tomorrow. We've heard time and time again that folks just want to visit with each other and hang out. So here's the space that we've created to do that. There are 6 different breakout rooms that we've created, and you're going to be able to self-select which room in just a moment you'd like to go to. So a little box will pop up and you'll be able to choose which of the rooms you want to go to. The groups are self-facilitated, but there is a host in each of the rooms, and you're welcome to be on video and eat your food, drink water, your sodas, that's completely fine. We do ask that you spell out acronyms the first time that you use them. Make sure everyone has a chance to share ideas. And the host in your room is going to be just gathering some of the top ideas from the group, and they may ask some additional questions for your group and make sure everybody has a chance to share ideas. So the 6th group, where it says main room, is an open topic where folks can just create the space they want to. You will not be joining a breakout room for that. You'll just be staying in this main space. So main room, open topic, that's just going to be free-form discussion that Ryan and I will be in the main room for. Ryan primarily, as I'm running tech. So just stay in this space if you want to stay in the main room. We'll ask for questions in a moment. We'll give you a couple minutes to grab your lunches, and then you'll just come back and go into the breakout rooms, and we will not be rejoining as a large group again at the end. I will leave the Zoom room open after 12:30 for a little bit. So if you're still in a discussion and you want to keep rolling, feel free to stay in that discussion and wrap up on your own, but I will close it before too long. So room 1 is around creating connections, coordinating on opportunities for partnership and mentorship. 2, funding and that's going to be with Amber of JRA. Room 2 is funding opportunities and sharing ideas for funding mechanisms for Living Shoreline with Leah. Room 3, telling your Living Shoreline project story, sharing successes and challenges. And that's going to be with Emily of JRA. Room 4, policy implementation, applying updated policies and guidance to current project designs. That's with Philippa of D&D in room 4. Room 5 is Living Shoreline messaging, communicating about the benefits of Living Shorelines with Emily Carlson of D&D. So again, it's going to be self-selecting groups. You'll have 2 or 3 minutes for a break to grab your food. Feel free to just eat. Again, make sure everyone has a chance to share feedback and share ideas during. Are there any questions for the small groups before we actually open it up? Does anyone have any questions? Okay, looks like I'm gonna go ahead and open up this. So any questions from anyone? All right, thanks again, everyone, for joining the Living Shoreline Summit. It's been a delight to have all of you on. I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms. Feel free to take a few-minute break, and then we'll start.
There's a question in there if they can hop in and out of rooms.
You're welcome to do that if you'd like. Yeah. Any other questions? Thanks, Amber. Any other questions? So I'll open the rooms up. If you have any technical trouble, just let us know. Oh, Leah, can you see it? The rooms, Leah? It's not showing me the rooms. So Leah, if you could go ahead and open up the rooms, and I'll just stay in this space, that'd be great. So thanks again, everyone. You should see. So are the rooms open now, Leah?
Yes, they are. Are people able to see them?
All right, so you're welcome to go ahead and choose your room. Okay, great. And if you're just interested in general discussion, feel free to go ahead and stay in this space. And thanks again, everyone, for joining.